I was seriously ill. Instead of helping, my husband left for Paris with his lover for 2 weeks. He hid my medication, cut off the power and water, locking me in to die. But upon his return, when he opened the door, he suddenly turned pale. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive the unimaginable to claim your justice. The sound of the key turning in the heavy mahogany door was the sweetest sound I had heard in 14 days. I sat perfectly still on the new emerald green velvet sofa, letting the rich fabric ground me in the present moment. The front door of our Buckhead mansion clicked open. I could hear the faint sound of Paris still lingering in their joyful laughter. DeAndre, my husband of 5 years, was laughing, a deep, carefree sound that echoed in the grand entryway. Chelsea, my white sister-in-law, was giggling right beside him, her voice high and breathless. The heavy door swung wide. I watched them step into the foyer from the shadows of the living room. They immediately brought their hands up to cover their noses, pinching their faces in disgust. They were expecting the smell of a rotting body. They were expecting the smell of death. Death was supposed to be my final act. Death was supposed to be his ticket to freedom. He had cut the main power lines to the house. He had shut off the city water valve at the street level. He had swept my vanity clean of my life-saving lupus medication, stealing the very pills that kept my organs functioning. He locked the deadbolts from the outside, trapping me inside like a prisoner, and took a first-class flight to France. I was supposed to be a corpse. I was supposed to be a memory. I was supposed to be a tragic story he could tell his friends while spending my money. I could feel the cold leather of the remote control in my palm. The memory of the agonizing pain from the lupus flare-up still lingered in my bones, but it was entirely overshadowed by the burning desire for justice. When you are left alone in the dark, fighting for every single breath, your mind achieves a terrifying level of clarity. I mapped out his entire destruction while lying on the floor clutching my chest. He thought I was weak. He thought my illness defined my entire existence. But he failed to realize that the same discipline I used to track federal tax evaders for the government was the exact same discipline I would use to dismantle his pathetic life. I pressed a small silver button on the remote control in my hand. The massive crystal chandelier above the grand staircase blazed to life, bathing the entire foyer in brilliant, blinding white light. DeAndre dropped his custom leather duffel bag. The heavy bag hit the imported marble floor with a loud, echoing thud that shook the silence of the house. Chelsea let out a sharp, terrible gasp and stumbled backward, bumping hard into the heavy wooden doorframe. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. The expensive bubbles danced on my tongue, a celebration of my survival. I crossed my legs, smoothing the rich fabric of my emerald silk dress, ensuring every fold fell perfectly. I watched the blood drain completely from my husband's face. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. In his mind, I was exactly that. I was a ghost. I was a phantom sitting in his living room. "What is this?" DeAndre stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes darted around the immaculately lit room. The central air conditioning was humming perfectly, blowing cool air through the vents. The house smelled of fresh eucalyptus and expensive citrus candles, not the decay he had anticipated. "How are you alive?" he whispered, the cruel words slipping out before he could catch himself. "How are the lights on in here?" I set my crystal flute gently onto the polished glass coffee table. I picked up a thick piece of premium cardstock and tossed it across the glass surface. It slid perfectly, stopping right at the edge in front of his expensive designer shoes. "That is a receipt for $50,000, I said calmly, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "Concierge private medical services are quite expensive, DeAndre. When my organs started failing on day 2 because you hid my immunosuppressants, I made a single phone call. You see, you cut the utilities that were under your name. But you forgot that I am the one who actually pays the underlying bills in this house. You forgot that I am the one with the pristine credit score and the real financial power." Within 1 hour, I had a private medical team bring a diesel generator, an emergency water supply, and a portable IV station right to my living room. They flushed the toxins from my body. They stabilized my system. They saved my life. I was not going to die for you. I was never going to die for you. I was going to live to see you burn. DeAndre's initial shock rapidly twisted into violent, uncontrollable rage. His hands curled into tight, shaking fists at his sides. The realization that his perfect murder plot had failed utterly shattered his arrogant, confident facade. "You crazy witch!" he screamed, his face contorting with an ugly fury that I had never seen before. "This is my house. I am going to throw you out onto the street myself." He lunged forward, closing the distance between the foyer and the living room in 3 heavy, aggressive strides. He reached out his large hands, aiming directly for my exposed throat, intending to finish the job he had started 14 days ago. I did not even flinch. I did not blink. Before his hands could even graze the silk of my dress, 2 massive shadows stepped out from the dark dining room archway. They were private security contractors built like brick walls and dressed in tactical black suits. The first guard intercepted DeAndre mid-stride, grabbing his outstretched arm and twisting it sharply and violently behind his back. The second guard swept DeAndre's legs out from under him with ruthless precision. My husband hit the marble floor face first with a sickening smack that echoed through the room. He groaned in deep pain as the guards pinned him firmly to the cold stone, holding him completely and utterly immobile beneath their weight. I picked up my champagne glass and took another slow sip, enjoying the taste of victory. I looked down at his panicked, sweating face pressed hard against the floor. "Your house?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. "Look at the other piece of paper on the table, DeAndre. Read the deed." DeAndre strained his neck against the heavy, unforgiving hand of the security guard, pressing his cheek into the cold marble floor. His eyes desperately tried to focus on the legal document resting beside the expensive medical receipt. His chest he heaved with rapid, panicked breaths as the reality of his physical restraint set in. The bold black letters at the very top of the page spelled out warranty deed in clear, undeniable print. He read the names listed under the transfer of ownership section. The luxury property belonged solely and entirely to me. There was only one single name on that binding legal document. My name, Iman Brooks. His name was nowhere to be found. The house he had paraded around and the house he had used to impress his friends and his mistress was gone. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the impossible financial reality staring him directly in the face. "Chelsea, do something!" he screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic and desperation. "Call 911 right now. She is trespassing in our home. She forged those legal papers. She is holding us hostage with armed men." Chelsea immediately snapped out of her shocked, terrified trance. She pulled her expensive designer phone from her luxury purse, her fingers shaking wildly as she unlocked the screen. She dialed the police and immediately began weaponizing her tears. The transformation was instantaneous and completely sickening to watch. Her voice went up an entire octave, becoming shaky, breathless, and fragile. She played the terrified, helpless victim, perfectly leaning into every stereotype she could muster. "Please help us," she sobbed into the receiver, tears streaming down her pale face in a flawless performance. "My brother-in-law's wife has completely lost her mind. She broke into our house while we were traveling. She has armed men holding us here against our will. They are physically attacking my brother-in-law. Please send help quickly because she is going to kill us." She hung up the phone and glared at me, wiping her fake manufactured tears away with a vicious, ugly smirk. "You are going to prison, you crazy animal," she spat, her true racist colors bleeding through her sweet, innocent Southern belle act. "You are going to rot in a cell for this." I laughed softly, shaking my head at her pathetic, predictable performance. "I did not forge anything," I explained, taking another sip of champagne and leaning back comfortably into the plush velvet cushions. You see, DeAndre liked to play the grand role of a wealthy Atlanta real estate developer. He loved the high social status. He loved the wealthy image. But he completely lacked the actual money to back it up. This beautiful house was foreclosed on 3 months ago. 3 months. 3 whole months of urgent bank notices piled up in the mail while he ignored them. I watched the painful realization hit Chelsea like a physical blow to the stomach. DeAndre took the money meant for the heavy mortgage payments and spent it entirely on you, Chelsea. He bought you those custom Cartier bracelets you love so much. He bought you those expensive first-class tickets to Paris. He funded your romantic European getaway with the very roof over our heads. The bank finalized the foreclosure process while you two were busy taking romantic pictures under the Eiffel Tower. So I stepped in to clean up his mess. I went directly to the bank executives. I bought this entire sprawling estate in cash. I purchased it outright with my own hard-earned money. It is mine forever. You are the ones trespassing on my private property. I sat there looking at the two people who had plotted my painful, agonizing death. They thought they were the main characters in a romantic tragedy where the sick wife conveniently disappears. They thought their secret was safe behind closed doors. But they were nothing more than common criminals caught in a web of their own breathtaking stupidity. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently and irrevocably. I was no longer the victim waiting to die in the dark. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. The wail of police sirens suddenly pierced the quiet evening air of our exclusive gated neighborhood. The sharp, urgent sound grew louder and louder, echoing through the manicured streets of Buckhead until it stopped abruptly right outside my large front door. Flashing blue and red lights danced wildly through the sheer curtains of the tall living room windows, casting long, moving shadows across the walls. DeAndre let out a heavy, dramatic breath of relief. A nasty, triumphant smile spread across his bruised face, even as he remained securely pinned to the floor by the guards. "You are completely done, Iman," he sneered, spitting the hateful words at my feet. "You really thought you could get away with this little stunt? You are just a boring, penniless bean counter. You are nothing but a low-class worker. The police are going to drag you out of here in heavy iron chains." The heavy front door was pushed open aggressively. Heavy combat boots stepped into the bright foyer. Chelsea immediately started crying hysterically again, rushing toward the entering officers with her arms outstretched. "Officer, thank God you are finally here," she wailed, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "Arrest her immediately. She is a dangerous, violent intruder who broke into our home." The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stepped fully into the bright light of the chandelier. He wore a heavy tactical vest and carried an overwhelming, commanding presence that silenced the room. DeAndre craned his neck, struggling uselessly against the security guards to watch my imminent, humiliating downfall. "Arrest this crazy woman right now," DeAndre ordered, his voice dripping with arrogant, unearned entitlement. The lead officer did not reach for his metal handcuffs. He did not look at DeAndre bleeding on the floor. He did not look at Chelsea sobbing her fake tears. The officer walked straight past the crying, dramatic woman, completely ignoring her performance. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from where I sat comfortably on my expensive velvet sofa. He stood at strict, rigid attention, squaring his broad shoulders. He brought his right hand up to his forehead in a crisp, highly respectful military salute. "Agent Iman," the officer said, his deep voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the suddenly silent room. "The perimeter is fully secured and locked down. We are ready to proceed entirely on your command." The smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly from DeAndre's face, replaced by pure, unadulterated horror. The fake tears instantly dried up on Chelsea's pale cheeks, leaving her mouth hanging open. They both froze, completely paralyzed, staring at me in absolute terror as their entire fake world shattered into a million tiny pieces. DeAndre dropped his jaw, opening and closing it like a fish on a dry dock. The smug entitlement that radiated from his tailored suits vanished entirely, replaced by raw terror. The commanding officer did not wait for my husband to find his voice. He waved his hand, and a dozen heavily armed agents flooded into the foyer. They did not wear standard Atlanta police uniforms. They wore tactical vests emblazoned with Joint Task Force insignia, moving with coordinated military precision. They completely bypassed the crying, trembling form of Chelsea and zeroed in on DeAndre's home office. "What are you doing?" DeAndre screamed, finding his voice as an agent kicked open the solid oak doors to his private study. "You cannot go in there. That is private property. I know the mayor. I will have your badges." The lead officer handed him a thick stack of papers. "It is a federal search and seizure warrant approved by a federal judge 10 minutes ago." The officer stated, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "We are seizing all electronics, financial records, and encrypted storage devices." I remained on my emerald velvet sofa, watching the chaotic symphony unfold exactly as I had orchestrated it. DeAndre watched in absolute horror as agents carried out his silver laptop, his 3 backup hard drives, and a heavy steel lockbox he thought was impenetrable. His entire fraudulent empire was being bagged and tagged into clear plastic evidence containers right in front of his eyes. Panic finally overrode his arrogance. His hands shook violently as he snatched his cell phone from his pocket. He frantically dialed the one person who had spent his entire life cleaning up his messes, protecting him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. He called his mother Vivian, and while he was at it, he called his older brother Jamal, barking desperate commands into the receiver to get over to the house immediately. It took less than 15 minutes for the screeching of tires to echo from the driveway. Heavy, rapid footsteps stomped up the front steps. Vivian burst through the open front doors like a hurricane of synthetic outrage. She wore her signature double-stranded pearls and a pristine beige designer suit, looking every bit the self-appointed matriarch of Atlanta high society. Her eyes immediately locked onto me, sitting calmly in the center of the living room, and her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. "I knew it," she shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "I knew the moment my son married a girl from the South Side projects that you would try to drag him down into the gutter with you. You have always been jealous of our family. You have always envied our status." Vivian stormed past the armed agents, acting as if her country club membership gave her federal jurisdiction. She marched right up to the coffee table, looking down at me with burning contempt. "You are nothing but a common street hustler masquerading as a professional," she spat, adjusting her pearl necklace to steady her breathing. "My son is a brilliant real estate developer. He is a visionary. You are just an angry, bitter woman trying to steal the wealth he built with his own 2 hands." I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting her run out of breath. "It is fascinating how you confuse crushing debt with wealth," Vivian, I replied calmly. "Your visionary son could not even afford the electricity bill this month." Vivian sneered, reaching into her designer handbag. She pulled out a crisp legal document and slammed it onto the glass coffee table right next to my medical receipt. "You think you are so smart, Iman, but we were prepared for your ghetto extortion tactics. This is a post-nuptial agreement. You signed it 6 months ago. It explicitly states that you waive all rights to this property, to DeAndre's business assets, and to any spousal support. You get absolutely nothing. Now call off these fake rent-a-cops and get out of my son's house before I press charges for extortion." DeAndre looked at his mother with a sudden spark of renewed hope. He actually thought she had saved him. Chelsea sniffled from the corner, trying to compose herself, seeing a potential exit from the nightmare. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I simply reached into my purse and retrieved a small, sleek metal pen. I clicked the top, and a bright purple ultraviolet light beamed from the tip. I leaned forward and shined the harsh light directly over the signature line on the final page of her precious document. "You always called my government job boring, Vivian," I said, my voice slicing through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "You told all your wealthy friends that your daughter-in-law was just a penniless bean counter who sat in a cubicle all day. But you clearly do not understand what a forensic accountant actually does. My job teaches you how to look beneath the surface. It teaches you how to track hidden assets, uncover offshore accounts, and spot a poorly executed forgery from a mile away." I traced the UV light over the ink. "Look closely, Vivian. You can see the micro-abrasions in the paper where the signature was digitally lifted and stamped. You did not even use a high-quality scanner. You copied my signature from a dry cleaning receipt I signed for DeAndre 2 weeks ago. Submitting a forged legal document to a federal agent is a felony. Congratulations, you just bought yourself a matching orange jumpsuit." Vivian's mouth dropped open. The color drained from her face faster than the water had drained from my pipes. Her hand trembled as she looked down at the glowing purple proof of her own federal crime. She stumbled backward, the rigid aristocratic posture collapsing into sheer panic. Before she could formulate a single excuse, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the porch. Jamal burst into the foyer, breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically from the federal agents to his mother, to his bleeding brother, and finally to his crying white wife in the corner. He looked bewildered, entirely ignorant of the trap that had snapped shut around his family. "What is going on here?" Jamal yelled, breathless and confused. "Mom said Iman was attacking everyone." I slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, placing my empty champagne flute on the table. I smoothed my emerald dress and turned my full attention to the newly arrived brother-in-law. The timing was absolutely perfect. "Jamal," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the devastating truth. "You drained your retirement account last month to give your brother a $100,000 business loan to save his failing company, did you not?" Jamal swallowed hard, glancing nervously at DeAndre. "Yes," he admitted defensively. "We are family. We support each other's ventures. It was an investment." I smiled, a sharp, ruthless smile offering zero mercy. "It was an investment, all right," I replied. "But not in real estate. Jamal, did you know that your $100,000 business loan fully funded the Paris suite he just shared with your wife?" Jamal froze completely in the center of the foyer. The heavy silence in the grand room was broken only by the sound of federal agents pulling hard drives from the adjacent study and the distant wail of police sirens outside. His eyes darted frantically from me, sitting calmly on my emerald sofa, to his brother bleeding on the floor, and finally to his wife huddled in the corner. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest, taking his breath away. The money he had drained from his own future, the funds he had sacrificed from his own retirement account, was spent on a romantic European getaway for his wife and his own flesh and blood. He stared at Chelsea, his hands trembling at his sides, unable to form a single coherent sentence. Chelsea saw the dangerous shift in her husband's eyes and immediately went to work. Her survival instincts kicked in, relying on the one weapon she had perfected since marrying into this family. She weaponized her tears. She let out a high-pitched, devastating wail and collapsed dramatically to her knees on the cold marble floor. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over her face as she buried her head in her hands, shaking her narrow shoulders with manufactured sobs. It was a calculated display of utter fragility. "Jamal," she cried, peering up at him with wide, terrified, tear-filled eyes. "She is lying. Iman is just an angry, jealous black woman trying to tear this loving family apart. She has always hated me because you all welcomed me with open arms. She is making up these vicious lies because her own husband cannot stand to be in the same room as her. She wants to destroy my marriage because hers is a complete failure. Please, baby, you have to believe me. She is trying to ruin us because she is bitter and sick. I would never betray you, Jamal." It was a masterful performance of white fragility, designed to immediately trigger the protective instincts of the men around her. And right on cue, Vivian stepped right into the trap. My mother-in-law rushed forward, positioning her pristine beige designer suit between me and the sobbing Chelsea. Vivian glared down at me, her chest heaving with indignation, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "How dare you, Iman!" Vivian shrieked, pointing a shaking, perfectly manicured finger at my face. "How dare you bully my delicate daughter-in-law? Chelsea has been nothing but an angel to this family since the day Jamal brought her home. She comes from good breeding. She has class and elegance. You are just a bitter woman from the projects projecting your miserable insecurities onto a beautiful, loving marriage. You are spinning these filthy ghetto lies because you cannot handle the fact that DeAndre is repulsed by you. Stop terrorizing this poor innocent girl immediately before I have you thrown out onto the street myself." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match Vivian's hysterical shrieking. I did not defend myself against Chelsea's racist, deeply offensive accusations. Arguing with narcissists is a complete waste of breath. Instead, I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk dress and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it directly at the 85-inch flat-screen television mounted proudly on the living room wall. "You see, Chelsea," I said, my voice completely steady, projecting absolute authority. "When you suffer from a chronic autoimmune disease, you spend a lot of time resting in bed. And when you spend a lot of time in bed, you notice things. You notice when your husband starts locking his phone and taking calls in the garage. You notice when your sister-in-law starts wearing a new expensive perfume that suddenly lingers on your husband's shirts after family dinners. So before you two embarked on your little Parisian adventure, I made a small, crucial investment. I installed high-definition hidden cameras in every single room of this house. I pressed the play button. The massive television screen flickered to life in brilliant 4K resolution. The audio was crystal clear, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The footage showed the very room we were standing in dated exactly one night before their flight to France. DeAndre and Chelsea were lounging intimately on my old sofa, sharing a bottle of my expensive wine. The room watched in absolute paralyzed silence as the digital version of Chelsea tossed her head back in a vicious, cruel laugh. Her voice blasted through the surround sound speakers, stripping away every ounce of her innocent Southern Belle facade and exposing the monster beneath. "Let that sick dog rot in the dark," the televised. Chelsea sneered, taking a deep gulp of wine and resting her bare legs across DeAndre's lap. "The moment you cut the power, her little medication fridge will shut down. She will be dead before we even land in Paris, and we can finally be free of her miserable existence." DeAndre leaned in, kissing her neck with greedy affection. "What about my brother?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Chelsea rolled her eyes, her face contorting with sheer disgust. "Jamal is a spineless idiot," she spat, the horrific racial slurs slipping easily and fluidly from her mouth, slicing through the current silence of the room like a rusty machete. "I cannot stand the smell of him anymore. I cannot stand any of them. Once that stupid fool signs his trust shares over to me, we are entirely done. We will take the money and put your pompous, arrogant mother in a cheap state-run nursing home. I am sick and tired of pretending to like these pathetic people." The video continued to play, but no one was watching the screen anymore. The air in the room had been sucked entirely dry. Vivian stumbled backward, clutching the heavy pearls at her neck as if she were actively suffocating. The white daughter-in-law, she had worshipped the woman she had placed on a pedestal above her own people, had just revealed her true horrific colors. Vivian's knees buckled under the heavy, crushing weight of the betrayal. But Jamal did not collapse. A primal, guttural scream erupted from deep inside his chest. It was the sound of a man whose entire reality had just been violently shattered. He did not go after his manipulative wife. He turned his absolute fury onto the man who shared his blood. Jamal launched himself across the grand foyer and tackled DeAndre with terrifying force. The two brothers crashed heavily onto the imported marble floor. Fists flew with blinding speed and unrestrained rage. The sickening sound of bone cracking against bone echoed through the grand house, overriding the background noise of the television. Blood splattered across the pristine white tiles, staining the expensive grout a deep crimson. DeAndre tried to defend himself, but Jamal was fighting with the unmatched strength of a completely broken man seeking immediate vengeance. Vivian shrieked in absolute horror, desperately grabbing at Jamal's torn shirt, trying to pull her sons apart. "Stop it!" she screamed, her voice cracking as tears ruined her makeup. "You are killing each other. Please stop fighting." I sat perfectly still on my emerald velvet sofa, watching the chaos unfold. I reached forward, picked up my crystal flute, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage Dom Perignon. The bubbles tasted even sweeter now that the truth was fully exposed. "Fight all you want, boys," I said, my voice gliding effortlessly over the sound of their violent brawl and Vivian's desperate sobbing. "You will need the exercise for the federal penitentiary." The tactical officers did not wait for my invitation to break up the bloodbath. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Jamal by the collar of his ruined shirt, yanking him backward off his brother. Jamal fought against their grip, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and dripping crimson onto the pristine white marble floor. DeAndre lay on his back, gasping for air and coughing up a thick spray of blood. His perfect tailored suit was torn. His perfect arrogant face was bruised. His perfect fake life was finally matching his miserable reality. Vivian shrieked as she rushed to her youngest son, dropping to her knees regardless of the blood ruining her beige designer skirt. She cradled DeAndre's face, glaring up at me with an intensity that could melt steel. "You have gone too far, Iman." "Man," she hissed, her voice trembling with an aristocratic rage she had spent decades perfecting. "You think bringing a few police officers into my home gives you power over me? You think you can humiliate this family and walk away untouched? I remained seated on the velvet sofa, adjusting the emerald silk of my dress. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman crying on the floor. Pity. Pity was a luxury she had never afforded me. Pity was a luxury I would not afford her. Vivian stood up, smoothing her ruined skirt and pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are nothing but a common street rat," she snarled, the venom practically dripping from her lips. Common. Common. That was the exact word she had used to keep me down for 5 years. Common. She used it to remind me of my working-class neighborhood, to diminish my hard-earned federal career, to make herself feel superior. But today, that word meant absolutely nothing. "I am the matriarch of a dynasty," Vivian proclaimed proudly, lifting her chin. "I sit on the board of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. I have direct access to our multi-million-dollar family investment fund. I will drain every single account we have to hire the most ruthless, high-powered defense lawyers in the state of Georgia. I will bury you in litigation, Iman. I will drag your name through the mud until you are begging to go back to the slums you crawled out of." I set my champagne glass down and sighed heavily. I reached down into my large leather tote bag resting beside the sofa. My fingers wrapped around the thick spine of a massive, heavy binder. I pulled it out and slammed it onto the glass coffee table right next to her forged post-nuptial agreement. The loud thud made Chelsea jump in the corner. Vivian looked down at the binder. The golden seal of the Internal Revenue Service was stamped perfectly on the front cover. "What family fund?" Vivian, I asked, leaning forward and looking directly into her panicked eyes. "Tell me exactly what fund you are talking about. Because as far as the federal government is concerned, your golden child has not closed a single legitimate real estate transaction in 6 entire years." DeAndre let out a weak, pathetic groan from the floor, trying to sit up. "Shut up, Iman," he coughed, spitting blood onto his hands. "Do not listen to her, Mom." "Oh, she is going to listen!" I commanded, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Your visionary son is a fraud, Vivian. He is a textbook scammer. He has been running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme right under your nose. He took investments from your wealthy country club friends, from your church members, from your socialite circle, and he funneled every single dime into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He used new investors to pay off the old ones to keep the illusion alive." Vivian shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. "No," she whispered, stepping backward. "No, my son is a genius. He built an empire. He built a house of cards," I corrected her sharply. "And here is the best part, Vivian, the absolute sweetest part of this entire tragedy. DeAndre needed a primary guarantor to open those fraudulent corporate accounts. He needed someone with pristine, established credit and a clean background to sign as the liable party. He used you. He used your name. He used your social security number. You signed every single piece of paper he put in front of you because you trusted your perfect son. Liable. Liable. You are entirely federally liable for every stolen dollar." Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The air in her lungs simply vanished. She looked down at DeAndre, who could not even meet her eyes. He turned his bruised face away, staring at the baseboards. The realization crashed into her, destroying her haughty posture instantly. Her own son had served her up on a silver platter to save himself. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of a cell phone shattered the heavy silence in the room. Vivian jumped, clutching her designer handbag. Her hands shook violently as she pulled the phone out and looked at the caller ID. It was Preston, her senior wealth manager at the bank. "Answer it," I instructed, leaning back into the sofa. "I am sure Preston has some very interesting updates regarding your portfolio." Vivian pressed the phone to her ear, her hand trembling so badly the device kept tapping against her cheek. "Preston." She answered, her voice completely stripped of its usual commanding tone. "What is going on?" I could hear the frantic, panicked voice of the wealth manager bleeding through the small speaker. "Vivian, I do not know what is happening," he shouted. "The feds just walked into the branch. Every single account with your name on it has been frozen. You're checking your savings, your retirement, the family fund. Everything is locked. They are seizing the assets, Vivian. You have zero balance. Zero. Zero." The word echoed in her mind, draining the last ounce of defiance from her body. The phone slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the floor, shattering the screen. Vivian dropped to her knees right next to DeAndre, her hands covering her face as a loud, guttural sob ripped through her chest. The empire was gone. The aristocratic pride was gone. All that remained was a broke, desperate woman facing federal prison. Chelsea pressed her back flat against the wall, her blue eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Prison. Prison. The word flashed in her mind, terrifying her completely. She had thought she was untouchable. She thought her white tears and her delicate victim act would shield her from any real consequences. But the FBI does not care about fake tears. They care about paper trails. And the paper trail I had meticulously handed over to my director pointed directly at her manicured hands. Jamal remained frozen near the grand staircase, staring at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the sheer curtains. Betrayed. Betrayed. He had given his brother everything. He had drained his own life savings. He had defended his wife against my warnings for years. Now he was standing in a foreclosed mansion watching his entire reality burn to ash. A sudden harsh screeching of heavy tires drew my attention to the front windows. Outside on the manicured circular driveway, three massive black armored SUVs slammed on their brakes, blocking any possible exit. The heavy doors swung open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing dark sunglasses and bulletproof windbreakers, bearing the bright yellow letters FBI, poured out onto the pavement. The real party is just getting started. I smiled, standing up and smoothing my dress. The heavy oak front doors did not just open, they were practically taken off their hinges. Armed agents in dark tactical gear swarmed the grand foyer. "Nobody move!" A commanding voice echoed. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression, marched directly past Vivian. He stopped right in front of DeAndre. "DeAndre, you are under arrest," the agent stated. "We have federal warrants for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, international tax evasion, and attempted manslaughter." Attempted manslaughter. The words hung in the air. DeAndre looked at the federal agents, and the reality of a 20-year sentence shattered his arrogant delusions. The perfect fake life he had built, it was all gone. And faced with the absolute destruction of his freedom, the grand romantic love story between him and his white sister-in-law instantly imploded. "It was her!" DeAndre screamed. He pointed a shaking, bloody finger directly at Chelsea. "She made me do it. She planned the whole thing. She is the one who took the money from the accounts. She is the one who told me to cut the power to the house. She went into the bathroom and hid my wife's medication. I never wanted to kill anyone. She forced me to do it." Chelsea let out a shrill shriek. The fragile victim persona she had weaponized for years evaporated. "You lying piece of garbage," Chelsea spat. "I did not force you to do anything. You manipulated me. You told me your wife was already dying. You promised me millions of dollars if I ran away with you. I am a victim of your financial abuse. I am a victim here." DeAndre laughed as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. "A victim," he sneered. "You spent weeks researching exactly how long a lupus patient could survive without immunosuppressants and water. You printed out the medical articles. You packed the bags for Paris while my wife was asleep upstairs. You even tried to access the life insurance policy the morning we landed in France. Tell the feds about that, Chelsea. Tell them how much of a victim you are while you were shopping for Cartier on my stolen credit cards." "Liar," Chelsea screamed, thrashing against the federal agent holding her back. "You stole that money from your own mother. You told me Vivian was too stupid to ever check the primary guarantor documents. You set your own family up to take the fall." I stood there watching the rats turn on each other as the ship went down in flames. They were tearing each other to shreds, exposing every dark, twisted secret they had buried under their facade of wealth and privilege. Jamal stood completely paralyzed near the staircase, his face ashen as he listened to his wife and his brother casually admit to orchestrating a cold-blooded murder and a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. The betrayal was so absolute, so deeply vile that Jamal could not even form words. I walked calmly across the foyer, the emerald silk of my dress brushing against the cold marble floor. I approached the lead federal agent, ignoring the pathetic screaming match happening behind me. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive, holding it up to the harsh tactical lights. Agent, I said, my voice steady and unwavering, cutting through the noise of their pathetic bickering. You will not need to rely on their conflicting confessions. Everything you need is right here on this drive. While they were enjoying their romantic European getaway, I was locked in the dark fighting for my life, but I was also tracking their digital footprint. They logged into the luxury hotel wireless network in Paris, using the exact same IP address. They sat in their expensive suite side by side and executed the final wire transfers to move the stolen funds into their offshore Cayman accounts. I have the timestamps, the network logs, and the digital signatures. It is a fully documented joint conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and attempted murder. There is zero room for reasonable doubt. The agent took the flash drive from my hand, nodding with professional respect. Thank you, Agent Eman, he said, securing the evidence in a plastic bag. This makes our job significantly easier. Vivian, who had been listening to this entire exchange, finally grasped the terrifying magnitude of her situation. The aristocratic matriarch, the woman who had spent decades looking down her nose at my working-class background, the woman who had called me a common street rat just 10 minutes ago, realized she was utterly and completely ruined. Her pristine credit was destroyed. Her socialite status in Atlanta was gone. Her name was tied to a massive federal Ponzi scheme, and she was facing imminent arrest and decades in federal prison alongside her favorite son. The sheer terror broke her. Vivian dropped to her knees on the blood-stained marble floor. She crawled frantically toward me, casting aside every ounce of her remaining dignity. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my emerald dress, clutching the fabric like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. Man, please," she sobbed, heavy, ugly tears, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her pearl necklace. "Please, you have to save me. I did not know what they were doing. I am innocent. You are the best daughter-in-law this family has ever had. I was wrong about you. I will give you my jewelry. I will give you the country club memberships. I will give you everything I have. Just please tell the agents I had nothing to do with this. Please save this family, Iman. Please save me from going to prison. I beg of you." I looked down at the older woman weeping hysterically at my very feet, still holding tightly onto my silk dress. The absolute desperation in her eyes was intoxicating. I stepped back in sheer disgust, tearing the hem of my emerald silk dress right out of Vivian's trembling hands. I let her fall flat on her face against the cold, hard marble floor. The loud smack of her cheek hitting the stone echoed through the grand foyer, blending seamlessly with the heavy breathing of the federal agents securing the perimeter. "You call what you did to me family?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly, chilling whisper. "You stood by happily while your favored son locked a sick woman in a pitch-black house without running water or medication. You knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was doing. You get absolutely zero mercy from me, Vivian." The federal agents hauled Vivian roughly to her feet, ignoring her pathetic cries for a lawyer. They pushed her firmly toward the front door, where armored vehicles waited. Chelsea was already screaming in the back of a cruiser, kicking the reinforced glass like a rabid animal trapped in a cage. Jamal stood completely frozen in the corner, surrounded by agents looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man whose entire existence had been a lie. Then a sharp, psychotic laugh sliced through the tension in the room. I turned slowly to look at DeAndre. He was on his knees, bleeding profusely from the violent brawl with his brother tightly handcuffed by two massive tactical agents. But he was laughing. It was a dark, maniacal sound that rattled against the high, vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The panic that had consumed him moments ago was suddenly replaced by a twisted, terrifying arrogance. "You really think you won, Iman?" he sneered, spitting a mouthful of warm blood onto the pristine white floor. "You think putting me in a federal cage means you get to walk away and enjoy my beautiful life? You are a dead woman walking." The lead FBI agent yanked DeAndre upward by the collar of his ruined, custom-tailored suit. "Keep your mouth shut," the agent commanded, his grip tightening significantly. "No, let him speak," I said, holding up a steady hand. "Let us hear the final brilliant strategy of a failed real estate scammer trying to play chess with a federal accountant." DeAndre grinned, his teeth stained crimson against the bright lights of the chandelier. "You always were too focused on the obvious banking accounts, Iman. You missed the shadow play completely. 6 months ago, when I realized your precious immune system was failing, I took out a $10 million life insurance policy on you. $10 million payable directly to me upon your untimely tragic demise. I crossed my arms, maintaining my perfectly calm, absolute composure. Buying a policy on a sick spouse is standard financial planning, DeAndre. It does not make you a criminal mastermind, it just makes you predictable. But selling the beneficiary rights to a cartel loan shark, does he barked a wild, frantic look in his eyes. I owed the Romero syndicate $5 million from a bad investment down in Miami. They were going to kill me and drop my body in the swamp. So I leveraged your life. I legally transferred the beneficiary rights of your $10 million policy directly to them. The contract stated they get the full payout the exact second your heart stops beating. I told them you were locked in this house dying of a severe lupus complication. They expect that money to clear by tomorrow morning. The room went dead silent. Even the seasoned federal agents paused, exchanging wary, alarmed glances. The Romero Syndicate was a notoriously violent organization that operated with ruthless efficiency. DeAndre had effectively placed a $10 million bounty on my head and handed the trigger directly to a criminal empire. They do not care about federal warrants. Iman. DeAndre taunted, his voice dripping with venomous, triumphant joy. They do not care about the IRS or your fancy forensic accounting tricks. They only care about getting their cold, hard cash. When they find out you survived and ruined their payday, they will hunt you down like a dog. They are coming for you whether I am sitting in a prison cell or not. You will never sleep a single night in peace. You are already dead. I stood there looking at the pathetic man I had married 5 years ago. He was willing to sell my actual physical life to ruthless criminals just to cover his illegal gambling and fraud debts. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he held the ultimate untouchable trump card that would ensure my destruction. I threw my head back and laughed. I laughed so incredibly hard that I actually had to reach up and carefully wipe a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. DeAndre's twisted, confident smile faltered instantly, his brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. "What is so funny, you crazy witch?" he yelled, straining uselessly against the heavy grip of the federal agents holding him. I pulled my smartphone from my leather purse and tapped the screen, connecting it instantly to the massive 85-inch television in the living room. A highly detailed legal document flashed onto the bright screen. The official seal of the life insurance conglomerate sat perfectly at the top of the page for everyone to see. "UMUD, one fatal critical error," DeAndre, I explained, walking slowly toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. "You are incredibly lazy. You used my personal home network and my desktop computer to process that transfer of beneficiary rights. You really thought a forensic accountant for the federal government would not monitor every single byte of data, leaving her own personal internet protocol address." DeAndre stared at the giant screen, his eyes scanning the digital document in pure frantic horror as the reality began to sink in. "I intercepted that transaction 3 weeks ago," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal cold certainty. "I hacked into the insurance portal and legally changed the primary beneficiary. I completely wiped your name and the cartel's holding company off the policy. I transferred the entire $10 million payout directly to the National Lupus Foundation. It is a completely airtight, irrevocable charity designation approved by the state." DeAndre's knees buckled completely. The federal agents had to physically hold his entire body weight up to keep him from collapsing back onto the blood-stained floor. "You just sold a ruthless cartel loan shark. A completely worthless piece of paper," I whispered, leaning in so close he could smell the expensive champagne on my breath. "You promised them $10 million by tomorrow morning and gave them absolutely nothing. They are not going to hunt me down, DeAndre. I am not the one who stole $5 million from them and lied about the collateral." The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. The cartel was not going to target me. They were going to target the man who scammed them out of their money. And federal prison was not going to protect him from the long, violent reach of the Romero Syndicate. "No," DeAndre gasped, his voice cracking as pure, unadulterated dread consumed his entire body. "No, you cannot do this to me. You have to change it back. Iman, please, they will kill me in there. They have guards on their payroll. They will gut me alive before I even see a judge." I simply smiled, turning my back on him entirely. "Take him away," I told the lead agent. Before the agents could even drag my screaming husband toward the front door, a sudden heavy, violent pounding erupted against the thick, solid oak wood of the entrance. The booming noise shook the very walls of the mansion. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of something heavy and metallic smashing against the reinforced door, attempting to break the hinges entirely. The heavy, solid oak doors of the mansion did not just rattle. They exploded inward with a deafening, thunderous crack that shook the very foundation of the estate. Massive splinters of expensive imported wood rained down across the blood-stained marble foyer. The dozen federal agents inside the house immediately spun around, dropping into tactical combat stances. They drew their black Glock service weapons, shouting overlapping commands to freeze and drop to the ground. But the men stepping through the ruined threshold were not local police backup. They did not wear shiny silver badges or cheap blue windbreakers. They wore custom-tailored Italian suits stretched tightly over heavy Kevlar body armor. They carried matte black assault rifles with a terrifying casual elegance that completely ignored the federal weapons pointed directly at their chests. A man in a pristine silver-gray suit stepped smoothly through the center of the heavily armed formation. He possessed an icy, chilling aura that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He brushed a speck of dust from his lapel and looked around my grand foyer with mild distaste. He acted as if the screaming FBI agents did not even exist in his universe. His dark, calculating eyes swept right past the flashing red and blue lights outside, right past the tactical gear, and locked directly onto my bleeding, handcuffed husband, kneeling on the floor. DeAndre the man said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that sliced right through the chaotic shouting of the federal authorities. "You missed our morning deadline. We had a very specific and very binding financial arrangement." The lead FBI agent took a bold step forward, keeping his weapon aimed squarely at the man in the silver suit. "This is a federal crime scene," the agent bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Drop your weapons immediately and put your hands behind your heads or we will open fire." The man in the silver suit did not even blink. He just offered a cold, humorless smile. The armed enforcers standing behind him simply tightened their grips on their assault rifles, entirely unfazed by the threat of federal bullets. It was a terrifying Mexican standoff right in the middle of my foyer. DeAndre started sobbing uncontrollably. The arrogant real estate developer who had just bragged about his genius intellect was now weeping like a terrified child. He tried to crawl backward away from the door, violently pulling against the agents holding him. "Please," DeAndre cried, begging the FBI agents who were just about to arrest him. "Please, you have to protect me. Do not let him take me. He is going to kill me." The man in the silver suit, who I instantly recognized from my forensic financial files as Mateo Romero, shook his head in profound disappointment. "You see, gentlemen," Mateo said, addressing the federal agents, but never taking his dark eyes off my husband. "DeAndre here has a terrible gambling habit and a worse track record for paying his debts. He owes my syndicate $5 million. But he swore on his mother's life that a $10 million life insurance policy on his sick wife would clear into our accounts by 8 o'clock this morning. He promised that if the wire transfer failed my associates, and I could walk into this house and take our payment directly out of his family's flesh." The brutal reality of the situation crashed down on Vivian. The haughty aristocratic matriarch who had spent decades looking down her nose at my working-class background finally realized that her golden boy had literally sold their physical lives to a ruthless criminal empire. She scrambled to her feet, her beige designer suit ruined with her son's blood. She frantically adjusted her tangled pearl necklace, desperately trying to summon the commanding presence of Atlanta high society one last time. Vivian threw herself between Mateo's armed enforcers and her weeping son. "Wait!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "You do not have to resort to violence. We are a prominent family. We have immense assets." She gestured wildly to the massive gilded frames hanging proudly on the towering walls of the living room. "Look at this collection," she begged, pointing at the large, vibrant canvases. "We have original Romario Bearden paintings. We have an early Kehinde Wiley. We have Basquiat's. This is a generational black art collection curated over decades. It is worth at least $8 million at any luxury auction house. Take the art. Take every single piece on these walls. It more than covers his debt. Just spare my son." I watched this pathetic display of aristocratic desperation from the center of the room. I watched my mother-in-law try to buy her son's life with the very symbols of the fake wealth she had used to humiliate me for 5 years. I did not flinch. I did not cower behind the federal agents. I calmly adjusted the emerald silk of my dress and walked right through the line of drawn federal weapons. I stepped right up to the ruthless cartel boss. I reached deep into my large leather tote bag. I pulled out a thick stapled stack of papers featuring the official seal of a certified luxury appraiser. I raised my hand and tapped Matteo lightly on his tailored silver shoulder. Matteo turned his head, his cold eyes narrowing at my sheer audacity. The federal agents tensed, preparing for a bloodbath. I handed the cartel boss the thick stack of appraisal papers. "The art is completely fake," I stated, my voice ringing out clearly and flawlessly in the tense, silent room. DeAndre stripped the actual canvases out of those expensive gilded frames over 8 months ago. He sold the original masterpieces to a shadowy black market dealer in Dubai just to cover the skyrocketing interest on his various gambling debts. You are looking at high-quality digital canvas prints, ordered in bulk, from a cheap manufacturing warehouse in China. I had a private appraiser confirm it last week. The frames are worth more than the paintings. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. She stared at the walls, her entire legacy, her entire identity exposed as a cheap, worthless fraud. Matteo slowly processed the official valuation report in his hands. He looked at the Chinese manufacturing receipts I had attached to the back. He slowly turned his head back to look down at DeAndre. The look in the cartel boss's eyes was no longer just professional disappointment. It was a chilling, silent promise of slow, agonizing, unspeakable death. "He has absolutely nothing left to give you," I whispered, finishing my sentence with a sharp, victorious smile. Mateo Romero did not shout. He did not curse. He gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod to the heavily armored men standing behind him. That tiny movement was the spark that ignited an absolute powder keg inside my grand foyer. The cartel enforcers raised their matte black assault rifles in perfect unison. The lead FBI agent bellowed a command to engage. Total chaos erupted. The sound of shouting voices, heavy boots scuffling against the marble, and tactical gear crashing together filled the massive room. One of the federal agents lunged forward, tackling the closest cartel enforcer into the glass coffee table. The expensive glass shattered into a million sparkling shards, raining down on DeAndre as he curled into a pathetic, whimpering ball on the floor. It was a violent, explosive collision between federal authority and organized crime right in my living room. Fists flew, weapons were wrestled toward the ceiling, and the deafening noise of the struggle echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. But while the federal task force was entirely distracted by subduing Matteo and his heavily armed muscle, someone else was making a move in the shadows. Chelsea had been sitting on the floor in the corner, her hands secured behind her back in standard-issue steel handcuffs. She had been playing the terrified, weeping victim flawlessly, but the moment the agents turned their backs to fight the cartel, her fragile, innocent mask completely vanished. Her sobbing stopped instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, calculated desperation. Chelsea twisted her wrists with practiced flexibility. She reached up and pulled a long, reinforced metal hairpin from her perfectly styled blonde hair. She was not just a delicate country club housewife. She was a seasoned grifter who had spent her entire adult life manipulating her way out of consequences. With a few swift, practiced twists of the hairpin, she picked the locking mechanism. The steel cuffs clicked open and slid off her wrists. Chelsea scrambled to her feet. She looked around the chaotic room and realized the terrifying truth. The money was gone. DeAndre was going to federal prison. Her fake luxury lifestyle was entirely over. She was facing decades behind bars for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. The sweet, helpless persona she had weaponized against this black family for years evaporated completely, leaving nothing but a cornered, vicious animal. She darted across the periphery of the brawl, moving swiftly toward the massive stone fireplace. Resting on the marble mantelpiece was a decorative antique dagger, an ornate piece Vivian had purchased to make the room look more aristocratic. Chelsea grabbed the jeweled hilt, gripping it tightly in her hand. Vivian was still kneeling on the floor nearby, completely paralyzed by the revelation that her entire art collection was fake and her son had sold her out to a cartel. She was breathing heavily, trying to process her utter ruin. Chelsea did not hesitate. The woman who had defended Chelsea, the mother-in-law, who had worshipped her whiteness and placed her on a pedestal above me, was now nothing but a human shield. Chelsea lunged forward. She violently twisted her manicured hand into Vivian's perfectly styled hair, yanking the older woman backward with brutal force. Vivian let out a piercing, terrified shriek as her neck was exposed. Chelsea wrapped her other arm tightly around Vivian's throat and pressed the edge of the antique dagger directly against the matriarch's skin. "Nobody move!" Chelsea screamed at the top of her lungs. Her voice had lost every single trace of its sweet melodic charm. It was harsh, grating, and dripping with venom. "Drop your weapons right now or I will slit her throat. I swear to God I will do it." The violent scuffle in the center of the room abruptly halted. The FBI agents who had just managed to disarm Mateo and pin his enforcers to the ground spun around. They aimed their service weapons directly at Chelsea, but hesitated, seeing the blade pressed against the older woman's neck. "Get me a car!" Chelsea shrieked, dragging a whimpering, hyperventilating Vivian backward toward the front door. "I want a car with the keys in the ignition, and I want safe passage out of this house. If anyone tries to stop me, I will kill her. I am not going to a federal prison. I am not spending the rest of my life in a cell because of you pathetic people." She yanked Vivian's hair harder, causing the older woman to cry out in sheer agony. "Shut up, you pompous old fool!" Chelsea spat directly into Vivian's ear, the horrific racial contempt finally unleashed for everyone to hear. "I always hated you. I hated your fake money, your fake class, and your entire miserable family. You were nothing but a bank account to me." Jamal, who had been watching his family self-destruct from the staircase, fell hard to his knees. The spineless enabler was completely broken by the sight of his wife holding his mother hostage. "Chelsea, please." Jamal begged, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "Please stop this. That is my mother. I loved you. I gave you everything. Put the knife down, baby, please. Do not hurt her." I stood perfectly still, near the shattered coffee table, completely unfazed by the screaming hostage situation unfolding in my foyer. I did not panic. I did not beg. I simply raised my right hand and gave a subtle, distinct signal to the two massive private security contractors who had been standing silently in the shadows of the dining room archway since the very beginning. Chelsea's wild, desperate blue eyes. "Chelsea," I said, my voice projecting a calm, lethal authority that instantly silenced Jamal's pathetic sobbing. "That decorative antique dagger you are holding was purchased by Vivian at a discount estate sale 5 years ago. It is a cheap theatrical prop made of completely dull aluminum. It could not even cut through a stick of warm butter, let alone human skin." Chelsea froze her eyes, darting frantically as she realized the blade in her hand felt suspiciously light. "But my security team carries state-of-the-art, tactical firearms." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "And the lasers currently resting on your chest are very real." Chelsea looked down at her own torso. 3 bright, solid red sniper dots were painted perfectly across the center of her chest, completely steady and locked directly onto her heart. The metallic clatter of the dull aluminum dagger hitting the marble floor sounded like a deafening gong in the sudden silence of the grand foyer. Chelsea stared down at the 3 solid red laser dots painted perfectly over her heart, her eyes wide with absolute primal terror. The fragile Southern Belle facade completely melted away, leaving only a cowardly, desperate woman realizing she was mere seconds away from catching a high-velocity sniper round. She threw her hands into the air, her manicured fingers trembling violently, and fell to her knees, surrendering completely to the overwhelming force surrounding her. The federal agents did not hesitate. 2 heavily armored tactical officers lunged forward, tackling Chelsea hard into the blood-stained marble. The heavy impact forced a sharp gasp from her lungs. They wrenched her arms behind her back with zero gentleness, snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. She kicked and thrashed, screaming obscenities that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, but her protests were utterly useless against the crushing weight of the federal authorities. Vivian remained collapsed on the floor, clutching her neck where the fake blade had rested just moments ago. The aristocratic matriarch was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged gasps of air. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive beige designer suit was ruined beyond repair. She stared in sheer traumatized disbelief at the woman she had practically worshipped. The white daughter-in-law she had placed on a pedestal above her own people. The woman she had constantly used to belittle my working-class roots had just held a blade to her throat and threatened to kill her without a single second of hesitation. Vivian's entire worldview, her obsession with fake status and proximity to whiteness, shattered completely, leaving her a hollow, broken shell of a woman gasping for air on the floor of a foreclosed mansion. While the agents secured the perimeter and dragged a kicking, screaming Chelsea toward the front doors, a pathetic shuffling sound drew my immediate attention. Jamal, the man who had stood by silently while his family abused me for years, was crawling across the debris-littered floor. His knees dragged through the shattered glass of the coffee table, completely ignoring the sharp cuts forming on his expensive trousers. He crawled directly to where I stood in my flawless emerald silk dress and collapsed heavily at my feet. "I man, please," Jamal sobbed, grabbing the hem of my dress with shaking, blood-stained hands. His face was a mask of pure, pathetic desperation, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. "Please, you have to help me. You have to save me from this absolute nightmare." I had absolutely no idea what they were doing. I swear to God I did not know anything about their violent plans. I looked down at my brother-in-law, feeling nothing but cold, clinical disgust. He was the classic enabler, a coward who hid behind his brother's arrogance and his wife's manipulation, always claiming ignorance while happily reaping the financial benefits of their intense cruelty. "My own brother betrayed me!" Jamal wept, his voice cracking pitifully. "My own wife slept with him and plotted a massive federal fraud right behind my back. They took all my money, Iman. They drained my entire retirement account and left me with absolutely nothing but a shattered life. I am a victim here, just like you. We are both innocent victims of their sick, twisted games." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, trying to forge a bond of shared trauma. "Please, Iman, you are so smart. You have all this money now. You bought this entire house in cash. You have the federal agents on your side. Please just front me the cash to hire a good defense lawyer. I just need a fair chance to clear my name and prove I was not involved in DeAndre's illegal Ponzi scheme. I will pay you back every single cent. I swear on my life." I did not flinch. I did not soften. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off the luxurious silk of my dress, treating him like a foul, contagious disease. I took a slow, deliberate step back, creating a clear physical boundary between my absolute power and his pathetic weakness. "A victim, Jamal?" I asked, my voice dropping to a chilling, lethal whisper that cut straight through his loud sobbing. "You really think you can play the innocent bystander card with a forensic accountant who just dismantled your entire family's fraudulent empire piece by piece?" I reached into the front pocket of my large leather tote bag. I bypassed the massive IRS binder and pulled out a crisp, heavily stapled stack of printed papers. The bold federal seal of the Cybercrimes Division was stamped clearly across the top page. I tossed the stack of papers onto the floor right in front of Jamal's bleeding knees. Jamal stared down at the documents, his sobbing hitching in his throat. He did not need to read the fine print to recognize the formatting of a subpoenaed digital text message log. "You played the fool very well for 5 years, Jamal." I continued, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the foyer, ensuring every single federal agent in the room could hear me. "You pretended you were just a silent partner in your brother's fake real estate firm. But you were the one actively managing the offshore shell accounts, while DeAndre played the charming frontman. And when my autoimmune disease flared up, you did not just look the other way. You actively participated in my execution." Jamal's face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the smooth marble, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the undeniable proof of his guilt. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is not true. I never wanted you hurt." I flipped to the second page of the text log, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a highlighted exchange. "Let us read this together, Jamal. This is a direct text message sent from your personal encrypted phone to DeAndre's device dated exactly 14 days ago, the very morning he and your wife boarded their first-class flight to Paris. I cleared my throat and read the damning words aloud with ruthless precision. Did you remember to flush her pills down the toilet? Let me know the exact second she is dead, so I can legally claim my portion of the estate before the bank starts asking questions. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The federal agents who had been processing DeAndre and Chelsea stopped completely, turning their hard, unforgiving stares toward the man trembling on the floor. You knew exactly what they were doing, I stated, my voice cold and unyielding. You knew they had cut the power and water. You knew I was locked inside without my life-saving medication. You encouraged them to destroy my pills because you wanted your cut of the fraudulent estate before the foreclosure went public. You are not an innocent victim, Jamal. You are a cold-blooded, calculating accessory. Jamal opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The air in his lungs had entirely evaporated. The pathetic facade he had built was shattered, completely exposing the greedy, murderous coward hiding underneath. I signaled the lead FBI agent, who immediately directed 2 officers to flank Jamal. You are going down for conspiracy to commit murder, Jamal, I said, turning my back on him. Enjoy the federal penitentiary. The heavy federal handcuffs ratcheted shut around Jamal's wrists, with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the grand foyer. 2 heavily armored agents grabbed him by the shoulders and hauled him violently to his feet, dragging his trembling body away from the hem of my emerald silk dress. He sobbed uncontrollably, his expensive leather loafers slipping on the blood-stained marble floor as he was shoved toward the front entrance. I turned around, taking in the breathtaking scene before me. My entire toxic in-law family was completely restrained. Chelsea was pinned securely against the ruined oak door, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears. Vivian remained slumped on the floor, weeping into her destroyed beige designer suit, completely stripped of her aristocratic pride. Jamal was loudly weeping as an agent read him his Miranda rights. And DeAndre, my husband, was still pressed firmly against the cold stone floor, breathing heavily through his bruised face. The chaotic symphony of the federal raid buzzed around us, but a sudden eerie stillness washed over DeAndre. He stopped struggling against the tactical agents pinning his arms. He stopped looking at the federal warrants scattered across the shattered glass of the coffee table. He lifted his head and stared directly at me. The sheer panic in his dark eyes slowly gave way to a twisted, frantic confusion. He looked at my perfectly styled hair, my glowing skin, my steady, unwavering posture. His gaze dropped to my bare arms, noticing the complete absence of any medical ports or intravenous bruising. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a physical impossibility. If you did not have your medication, he whispered, his voice trembling. He shook his head violently, denying the reality standing right in front of him. If you did not have your medication for 2 weeks, you should be dead. You should be in a coma. He suddenly lunged forward, straining against the agents, his voice escalating into a hysterical, terrified scream. Your kidneys should have completely failed by day 5. Your immune system should have destroyed your organs. How are you standing there? How are you breathing? The federal agents shoved him back down hard against the marble, but I raised my hand, signaling them to give me a few inches of space. I walked slowly toward the man who had promised to love and protect me until death parted us. The sharp click of my heels against the floor sounded like a ticking clock marking the final seconds of his freedom. I knelt down gracefully, keeping my emerald dress pristine, and stepped inches from his bleeding face. I have not had a single lupus flare-up in over 2 years. DeAndre, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, chilling calm that made the surrounding agents freeze. My autoimmune disease has been completely in remission. I have been entirely healthy. DeAndre stopped breathing. His eyes widened in absolute shock as my words dismantled the very foundation of his murderous plot. But 6 months ago, I started feeling incredibly lethargic. I continued keeping my eyes locked onto his terrified gaze. I started waking up with agonizing joint pain. I found clumps of my hair clogging the shower drain every single morning. I experienced brutal nausea, and my lower back ached constantly, as if my kidneys were shutting down entirely. You told me it was my illness returning. You rubbed my back while I cried in pain. You held my hand in the dark and told me my body was failing me again. Chelsea gasped from across the room, the horrific realization of what she had been a part of finally dawning on her. But I am a forensic accountant. DeAndre, I whispered, stepping even closer. I do not just trust what things look like on the surface. I verify the data. When my prescribed immunosuppressants stopped working completely, I did not go to my regular physician. I went to an independent private specialist out of state and paid in cash. I ordered a comprehensive total body toxicology panel. My private lab tests did not show a lupus flare-up. They showed off the charts levels of acute heavy metal poisoning. You have been meticulously microdosing my morning coffee with thallium for half a year, DeAndre. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was deafening. The FBI agents stared at DeAndre with pure, unadulterated disgust, realizing they were holding a calculating, cold-blooded serial poisoner. Thallium is an odorless, tasteless, highly toxic metal that mimics the exact symptoms of a severe autoimmune failure. It causes hair loss, joint pain, and eventual organ death. DeAndre had researched the perfect undetectable weapon to execute his sick wife without drawing any suspicion from the medical examiner. He wanted my $10 million life insurance policy, and he wanted to play the grieving wealthy widower. You brought me a fresh cup of espresso in bed every single morning, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. You smiled at me, kissed my forehead, and watched me drink poison while you planned your romantic getaway to Paris with your brother's wife. You thought you were a flawless criminal mastermind pulling off the perfect untraceable murder. You thought I was just a weak, dying woman who would quietly fade away and leave you my fortune. DeAndre opened his mouth to deny it, to scream another lie, but the sheer weight of the evidence crushed the breath right out of his lungs. He knew I had the lab reports. He knew I had the toxicology screens. He knew his digital search history would show his extensive research into heavy metal toxins. His entire fake loving husband persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Vivian let out a horrifying guttural wail from the floor, pressing her hands over her ears. The aristocratic mother who had defended her golden boy at every turn was now forced to confront the gruesome reality that her favorite son was a literal monster. He had not just embezzled money. He had methodically and joyfully poisoned the woman sharing his bed. I stood back up, towering over the pathetic, bleeding man on the floor. I looked down at him with absolute zero pity. You wanted to play a deadly game of chess, DeAndre, I said, smoothing the rich silk of my dress. But you forgot who owns the board. The grand foyer went completely dead silent. The only sound left in the massive space was the ragged, panicked breathing of the man kneeling at my feet. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots crunching over the shattered glass of the coffee table. He gripped DeAndre securely by the shoulder and began reciting the Miranda rights with a cold, mechanical precision. You have the right to remain silent, the agent barked, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the attempted murder of your wife. Attempted murder. The words hung heavily in the air, sealing his absolute destruction. DeAndre shook his head wildly, his bloodshot eyes darting around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. He looked up at me, his chest heaving. If you knew I was poisoning you, why did you stay? He gasped, his voice cracking with desperate confusion. Why did you not just go to the police 6 months ago? Why did you let me keep bringing you coffee? Because simply sending you to jail for attempted murder was not enough, I said, my voice projecting clearly, so every single person in the room could hear me. You would have fought the charges while living comfortably in this mansion. I needed to strip you of absolutely everything before I dropped the hammer. I took a slow, deliberate step closer, ensuring my shadow fell entirely over his trembling form. Once I realized you were poisoning me, I played along. I explained, my tone completely devoid of mercy. I pretended to be bedridden. I stayed in the dark and let you think your brilliant, malicious plan was working flawlessly. I fed your massive ego, DeAndre. You thought you were leaving me locked in this house to die a quiet, untraceable death. DeAndre stared at me, his jaw trembling as the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation finally set in. The moment your first-class flight took off from Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, I got out of bed. I continued. I called a discreet, ultra-luxury private detox clinic in Switzerland. I boarded a private charter flight paid for with my own clean federal salary. I spent 10 days receiving intensive chelation therapy, flushing every last microscopic trace of thallium out of my system. My medical team rebuilt my immune system, while you were busy shopping for Cartier bracelets and drinking cheap wine in France. Chelsea let out a loud, pathetic sob from her corner, realizing her Parisian vacation was nothing but a calculated window of opportunity I had granted them. "You did not leave me to die." "DeAndre," I whispered, leaning down, so only he could hear the final devastating truth. "You left me alone long enough to completely and utterly dismantle your entire life. I seized your assets. I bought your foreclosed house. I orchestrated your absolute ruin while getting a chemical peel and a deep tissue massage." DeAndre let out a horrific, anguished scream. He thrashed against the federal agents, but they easily subdued him, slamming him face first back onto the cold marble floor. Suddenly, a loud, dramatic gasp echoed from the other side of the foyer. Vivian, the disgraced aristocratic matriarch, clutched her chest with both hands. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed heavily onto the floor, writhing and gasping for air. "My heart," she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, breathless wail. "I am having a massive heart attack. The stress of these vicious lies is killing me. I need a doctor immediately." The federal agents paused, their hands hovering over their radios. Vivian flopped around on the marble floor, putting on a spectacular theatrical performance. She knew that a severe medical emergency would force the authorities to transport her to a hospital instead of a cold concrete holding cell. It was her final desperate attempt to maintain control, to secure a luxury private suite at Emory Hospital where her wealthy friends could visit her and her expensive lawyers could build a defense strategy away from the federal lockup. "I'm on," Vivian gasped, reaching a shaking hand toward me. "Call the Platinum Concierge Medical Transport. Call the private ambulance service we use for the country club members. I need the premier cardiac unit. Tell them to send the helicopter. I am a prominent citizen. I cannot die on this floor." I watched my mother-in-law thrash around, faking a cardiac event with the dedication of a seasoned soap opera actress. She wanted a luxury escape route. I calmly pulled my smartphone from my leather tote bag. I looked down at Vivian, holding her gaze while her chest heaved with fake, agonizing pain. "Of course, Vivian," I said, my voice dripping with smooth Southern hospitality. "I will make the call right now." I unlocked my screen and dialed a short, direct number. I had not dialed the luxury private concierge ambulance service. I had not dialed the premium hospital network. I had dialed something else entirely. "Hello," I said, speaking clearly into the receiver. "Yes, I need to report an emergency at my residence. A woman is having a severe medical episode and requires immediate transport." Vivian peeked, one eye open, a smug, satisfied smirk momentarily breaking through her fake agony. She thought her aristocratic privilege had saved her from the humiliation of a squad car. But her smug smile vanished instantly when she heard the rest of my conversation. "Please dispatch a Standard County EMS unit immediately. No, we do not have private insurance on file for her. She will need to be transported directly to the overcrowded public county hospital downtown as an uninsured indigent patient." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my bag. Vivian stopped writhing completely. The fake heart attack vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Vivian scrambled backward on the marble floor, her expensive beige skirt hiking up her thighs, exposing her shaking knees. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot do this to me, a man," she gasped, her chest heaving with genuine panic now. "I am a prominent figure in Atlanta society. I sit on the board of 3 different charitable foundations. I do not ride in public city ambulances. They are filthy. They are completely unsanitary. I demand you call my private transport service immediately. You owe me that much respect." "Respect is earned, Vivian, not demanded," I replied, my voice echoing coldly through the grand foyer. "And you lost my respect the moment you decided my working-class background made me less of a human being." Within minutes, the loud wail of Standard City sirens pierced the exclusive quiet of our gated neighborhood. 2 burly paramedics barged through the ruined, splintered front doors. They did not wear the crisp, tailored scrubs and polite smiles of the private concierge medical team Vivian was accustomed to. They wore faded navy uniforms, heavy work boots, and carried themselves with the exhausted, no-nonsense demeanor of men who had been working a grueling 12-hour shift. They hauled a scuffed, squeaking stretcher that had clearly seen years of intense, messy county trauma calls. "Who is the patient?" the lead paramedic asked, looking around the chaotic, blood-stained foyer filled with heavily armed federal agents. Vivian shrieked as the paramedics approached her, pulling out a standard blood pressure cuff. "Do not touch me," she yelled, swatting wildly at the man holding the medical equipment. "I demand to be taken to the private cardiac wing at Emory Hospital. I have platinum tier premium insurance. DeAndre, tell them who we are. Tell them to use the premium card. Tell them to call the helicopter." I reached deep into my leather tote bag and pulled out the gleaming metallic platinum insurance card Vivian prized so much. It was the exact card she shamelessly flashed at pharmacy counters and private clinics to ensure she always skipped the line ahead of everyone else. I also pulled out a pair of sharp, heavy fabric scissors. Vivian stopped swatting at the paramedic and stared at the shiny metallic card resting between my fingers. I held the plastic up to the bright light of the crystal chandelier. "You really loved waving this card around, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting effortlessly through her hysterical complaints. "You bragged to all your wealthy country club friends that your highly successful real estate developer son provided his aging mother with the absolute best health coverage money could buy. You used it as a status symbol to prove how well you raised your boys. But we both know the ugly truth. DeAndre never paid a single premium for this policy." I slid the thick plastic squarely between the sharp steel blades of the scissors. "Since I have always been the sole primary breadwinner in this house, your premium insurance was filed under my federal corporate benefits plan. I added you as a dependent because your visionary son had zero legitimate income to insure you himself. But dependent status is a privilege, Vivian. And it is a privilege that can be instantly revoked." I squeezed the handles together with deliberate force. The scissors sliced through the thick plastic with a loud, satisfying snap. The two halves of the platinum card fluttered through the air and landed directly on DeAndre's blood-splattered chest. "I legally canceled your dependent coverage at exactly midnight last night," I announced, folding the scissors and dropping them back into my bag. "You have absolutely zero private medical insurance. You are entirely reliant on the state system now. You will go to the overcrowded public county hospital downtown. You will not get a private luxury suite overlooking the city skyline. You will be placed on a hard plastic chair in a crowded, noisy triage waiting room surrounded by the exact same working-class people you have spent your entire pathetic life looking down on." Vivian let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She kicked her legs wildly, fighting the paramedics tooth and nail as they lifted her onto the squeaking stretcher. "No," she wailed, thrashing her arms and ruining her expensive beige suit completely. "I am Vivian Sterling. I am old money. You cannot put me in a public ward. I will sue this entire city. I will have your badges." The paramedics ignored her aristocratic demands entirely. They expertly strapped heavy canvas belts across her chest and legs, binding her securely to the basic gurney. She writhed against the restraints, her perfectly styled hair falling into a tangled, ruined mess across her tear-stained face. She craned her neck desperately, looking at her golden boy on the floor. "DeAndre," she screamed, her voice cracking in sheer terror. "Do something. Do not let them take me to that place. Save me, DeAndre." But DeAndre could not save her. He was kneeling in his own blood, tightly handcuffed and surrounded by federal agents, completely powerless to stop his mother from being wheeled out the door like a common criminal. The paramedics hoisted the heavy stretcher and rolled the screaming, kicking matriarch down the front steps, disappearing into the flashing red lights of the standard city ambulance. The foyer felt suddenly empty without her hysterical shrieking, but the tension remained thick and suffocating. DeAndre stared at the ruined front door, watching his mother get hauled away. He slowly turned his head back to look at me. The sheer terror that had consumed him moments ago began to curdle into something far more toxic and desperate. He spat a thick wad of bloody saliva onto the pristine marble floor right next to my emerald silk heels. "You think you are so brilliant, Iman." He sneered, a vicious, ugly smile stretching across his bruised face. "You think stripping my mother of her insurance and putting me in federal cuffs means you actually won the war. You are nothing but a short-sighted government worker, playing a game you do not fully understand. I raised an eyebrow looking down at him. Enlighten me, DeAndre. What part of your complete financial and personal ruin am I failing to understand today? He let out a harsh, arrogant laugh that rattled deep in his chest. You took the house. You took the bank accounts. You even stopped the cartel. But you forgot my biggest asset, he bragged, his dark eyes gleaming with a delusional triumph. You forgot about my predictive accounting artificial intelligence algorithm. That software patent is revolutionary. It is going to change the entire global financial sector. I legally registered the intellectual property under a highly encrypted offshore corporate shell company in Belize entirely separate from the family fund you exposed. The federal agents holding him tightened their grip, but DeAndre ignored them completely, entirely focused on throwing his final trump card in my face. It is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Iman, he yelled, his voice dripping with venomous, arrogant pride. Tech giants are already bidding on the framework, so go ahead and send me to federal prison. I will gladly sit in a cell for a few years because the absolute second I walk out of those gates, I am going to sell that patent for $500 million. I will be richer than you could ever dream of being. I am a tech visionary. You are just a stepping stone on my path to becoming a billionaire. You can take the house, Iman, but you can never take my genius. I looked down at the man who truly believed he had outsmarted me, and I felt an overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated pity. DeAndre was still kneeling on the shattered glass of the coffee table. He was handcuffed and bleeding, but his chest puffed out with a pathetic display of masculine pride. He actually thought he was untouchable. He believed his own lies so deeply that he had convinced himself he was a misunderstood tech genius destined for greatness. The federal agents surrounding him simply watched in silence, allowing him to dig his own grave. You can take the brick and mortar. DeAndre spat, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. You can freeze the bank accounts and call the cops, but you cannot touch my mind, Iman. My predictive accounting AI software is already being reviewed by the biggest venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. The source code is locked in a secure offshore server in Belize. The second my lawyers post my bail, I am signing a licensing deal worth $500 million. I am going to walk away from this mansion and step right onto a private jet. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life working a boring federal job for a government pension while I become a titan of the tech industry. I let him finish his little speech. I let the silence hang heavily in the grand foyer, allowing the sheer absurdity of his delusions to echo off the high vaulted ceilings. Then I slowly shook my head. A tech visionary, I asked, my voice perfectly level. DeAndre, you do not even know how to write a basic line of Python. You cannot even troubleshoot your own email application without calling technical support. How exactly did you code a revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm designed for complex forensic financial modeling? DeAndre swallowed hard, but quickly recovered his arrogant sneer. I am the idea man. I conceptualized the framework. I am the architect. You are a thief, I corrected him sharply, stepping closer until the toe of my emerald silk heel was inches from his bleeding knee. You stole that algorithm from my personal encrypted hard drive 3 years ago. I spent thousands of hours writing that code during my evenings and weekends. I built that software to help the IRS track complex offshore tax evasion schemes. You waited until I was exhausted from my autoimmune flare-ups. You snuck into my home office while I was asleep and you copied the entire drive. You just slapped a sleek new user interface on my work, hired a cheap freelance developer to obscure the back-end architecture, and called it your own intellectual property. Chelsea, who was still pinned against the ruined front door by an agent, let out a loud, dramatic gasp. Even she had believed his fake tech genius persona. It does not matter what you say. DeAndre yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic as the foundation of his ego began to crack. Possession is 9/10 of the law. I filed the paperwork. I registered the patent under my holding company. My name is on the official federal registry. You cannot prove a single thing. I did not argue with him. I simply raised my right hand and signaled the lead FBI agent standing near the staircase. The agent nodded, pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from his tactical vest, and walked over to DeAndre. The agent dropped the heavy legal packet directly onto DeAndre's lap. "What is this?" DeAndre asked, staring down at the thick stack of papers resting against his handcuffed wrists. "That is a federal injunction, directly from the United States Patent and Trademark Office," I stated, projecting my voice with lethal clarity. "I knew you stole my code 3 years ago, DeAndre. But I also knew that if I confronted you without absolute proof, you would just delete the servers and destroy my hard work. So I kept my mouth shut. I let you spend thousands of dollars of your stolen Ponzi scheme money paying lawyers to patent the software. I let you do all the heavy lifting to get the intellectual property officially registered." DeAndre stared at the packet, shaking his head frantically. "No, no, you cannot take it. It is mine. I filed a quiet copyright infringement lawsuit in federal court 6 months ago. I continued delivering the final devastating blow. I provided the judge with the original metadata, the version history, and the encrypted federal timestamps from my secure government servers. My digital footprints were embedded deeply into the core architecture of the algorithm. The federal judge granted an immediate and permanent injunction. "The United States government officially revoked your fraudulent registration yesterday afternoon. The patent has been entirely and completely transferred to my name. You officially own absolutely nothing." DeAndre let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. It was the horrific, hollow sound of a man experiencing absolute ego death. His money was completely gone. His mistress had brutally betrayed him. His freedom had been snatched away by federal warrants. And now the one single thing keeping his narcissistic pride intact, his status as a brilliant tech visionary, was exposed as a pathetic lie. He was not a genius. He was just a thief who had gotten caught. He slumped forward, completely broken, pressing his bruised forehead against the cold marble floor. The utter destruction of my husband was complete. But the chaotic symphony of the evening was not quite finished. From the front entrance, a shrill, hysterical shrieking pierced the heavy air of the foyer. The paramedics were struggling to maneuver Vivian's stretcher over the splintered remains of the heavy oak doors. The disgraced matriarch was fighting against the heavy canvas restraints, her face twisted into a mask of pure, hateful rage. She kicked her expensive heels wildly, refusing to be loaded into the standard city ambulance waiting in the driveway. "You are a demon!" Vivian screamed at the top of her lungs, spitting venomous hatred in my direction. "You are a monster, Iman. You destroyed my brilliant son. You ruined a perfect family bloodline. We are a legacy. We are high society. You are nothing but a poisonous snake who infected our perfect home." I stood perfectly still, letting her furious racist insults wash over me without leaving a single mark. I watched the exhausted paramedics strain to control her thrashing body. They pushed the stretcher forward, inching toward the flashing red lights outside. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the emerald silk of my dress. I raised my hand and pointed a single commanding finger toward the doorway. "Stop!" I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. The paramedics immediately halted the stretcher right at the threshold of the ruined doors. Vivian panted heavily, glaring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I walked slowly across the blood-stained marble floor, my heels clicking sharply until I stood directly over the disgraced matriarch, looking deep into the terrified eyes of the woman who had made my life a living nightmare. From the center of the foyer, DeAndre finally broke. A loud, wretched sobbing erupted from his chest. The complete emotional collapse of an arrogant narcissist is a pathetic sight to witness. His money was seized, his lover was in handcuffs, his freedom was gone, and his self-proclaimed status as a tech genius had been exposed as a laughable fraud. He curled his knees into his chest, crying into the shattered glass and his own blood. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. His ego had been entirely obliterated. But Vivian was cut from a different cloth. Even strapped tightly to a squeaking public hospital stretcher, facing federal indictment and utter social ruin, her toxic aristocratic pride refused to die quietly. She thrashed her head against the thin mattress of the gurney, her eyes blazing with a rabid, unhinged fury. "You are a demon," she shrieked, her voice scraping against her throat. "You are a dirty, vile creature sent from the slums to destroy us. We had a perfect family bloodline, Iman. We were a prestigious legacy. You infiltrated our perfect home and ruined generations of excellence. I raised my hand and signaled the paramedics to hold their position for just one more minute. They obeyed instantly, stepping back from the stretcher and allowing me full command of the room. The federal agents securing the perimeter fell completely silent, sensing that the final act of this tragedy was about to unfold. A perfect family bloodline, I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal curiosity. A prestigious legacy. Let us talk about exactly how this family acquired that initial wealth, Vivian. Let us talk about Maya. DeAndre suddenly stopped crying. His head snapped up from the floor, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute sheer panic. Maya was DeAndre's beautiful, wealthy fiancée, who tragically drowned in a terrible boating accident on Lake Lanier. Exactly 5 years ago, I said, projecting my voice so every single federal agent could hear the history lesson. She was the sole heir to a massive shipping fortune. When her boat supposedly capsized in rough waters, DeAndre was the only survivor. And as her sole named beneficiary, your visionary son inherited her entire $4 million estate. That is the seed money he used to start his fake real estate firm. That is the money that funded your country club memberships and your designer suits, Vivian. You did not build a legacy. You built a graveyard. Vivian's face turned the color of chalk. You shut your filthy mouth, she hissed violently, thrashing against the heavy canvas belts binding her to the stretcher. It was a tragic accident. The police investigated and ruled it a terrible accident. You are making up vicious lies to hurt a grieving mother. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached my hand back into my large leather tote bag. I bypassed the forged documents and the IRS binders. I pulled out a thick, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the plastic rested a heavy metallic dive watch. It was covered in dried mud, river algae, and severe water damage, but the thick gold casing was still entirely intact. I held the plastic bag up to the bright light of the chandelier, dangling it right above Vivian's face. I never believed the official police report. I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the foyer like a sharpened blade. So 3 months ago, I used my federal clearance to quietly review the old case files. Then I hired an elite team of private deep-water divers to search the exact coordinates where Maya's body was recovered. They spent weeks combing the muddy bottom of that lake, and they found exactly what I paid them to find. I tapped a manicured finger against the plastic bag, highlighting the heavy gold watch. Maya was an experienced swimmer, I stated, turning my gaze to the lead FBI agent who had stepped closer, his eyes locked on the evidence bag. But she was wearing a heavily weighted dive belt when they found her body. The police thought she had been recreationally diving before the storm hit. But they never found her watch. They never found the piece of equipment that would tell them her exact depth and oxygen levels, because someone had deliberately unbuckled it and tossed it into the deepest trench of the lake to hide the truth. I turned back to Vivian, leaning down so she could see the muddy watch clearly. My divers recovered it. I whispered with lethal precision. And when my forensic team cleaned the back of the gold casing, they found a very specific custom engraving. It is a unique family crest, Vivian. The exact same crest that matches the missing piece of custom jewelry from your precious old money collection. The heavy gold pendant you claimed was stolen in a burglary 5 years ago. Vivian stopped breathing. Her eyes bulged as she stared at the muddy watch, recognizing the undeniable physical proof of her most horrific secret. You did not just support your son's financial crimes, Vivian, I said, standing tall and delivering the final devastating blow. You went on that boat trip with them. You deliberately tampered with Maya's life vest, and you used your heavy gold pendant to weigh her down when the boat flipped. You drowned an innocent woman in cold blood so your pathetic son could inherit her fortune and fund your aristocratic delusions. The lead FBI agent did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately raised his hand and signaled the paramedics to halt the medical transport entirely. The paramedics stepped away from the stretcher, raising their hands in compliance. The agent marched directly over to the gurney, pulling a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Vivian Sterling, the agent, commanded, his deep voice shaking the very walls of the mansion. You are no longer going to the hospital for a medical evaluation. You are under arrest for the first-degree premeditated murder of Maya Washington. Vivian let out a horrifying, blood-curdling scream that shattered the remaining glass in the living room. It was the sound of a monster finally being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. She thrashed and kicked her fake heart attack completely forgotten, fighting with the desperate feral energy of a caged animal facing the lethal injection chamber. DeAndre stared at his mother in absolute horrified silence. The arrogant golden boy, who thought he was the mastermind behind the family empire, finally realized he was nothing but a pawn in his mother's murderous game. He had profited from Maya's death, but Vivian had been the one to execute the cold-blooded killing. His entire life was built on the drowned corpse of the woman he had claimed to love. Jamal, who was still being held by the agents near the door, began to violently vomit onto the marble floor. The realization that his own mother was a ruthless, calculating murderer broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. The prestigious Atlanta family was not just a collection of financial fraudsters and greedy narcissists. They were a violent criminal syndicate masquerading as high society elites. The lead FBI agent locked the cuffs tightly around Vivian's wrists, binding her directly to the metal rails of the cheap county stretcher. She gnashed her teeth, her face turning a vibrant shade of purple as she screamed every filthy racist curse word she could summon. She cursed my name, my background, and my existence. But her screams meant absolutely nothing to me. They were just the pathetic dying breaths of an evil empire. I looked at the lead agent and handed him the clear plastic evidence bag containing the muddy waterlogged dive watch. The physical proof of her horrific crime rested heavily in his hands. The federal agents flanked the stretcher, grabbing the metal rails with firm, unforgiving grips. They shoved the squeaking gurney forward, rolling the shrieking, thrashing matriarch over the splintered wood of the ruined front doors. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers illuminated her terrified face as she was swallowed by the dark Atlanta night. The heavy wheels of the stretcher clattered over the splintered wood of the ruined front doors, but Vivian suddenly stopped thrashing. It was as if the invisible strings holding up her aristocratic persona had been abruptly severed. Her body went entirely limp against the heavy canvas restraints. Her chin dropped to her chest, and she stared blankly at the blood-stained marble floor she used to rule. The harsh, flashing red and blue lights from the federal cruisers illuminated the terrifying realization washing over her face. She was not just going to federal prison. She had been comprehensively outplayed by a mind vastly superior to her own. Vivian slowly raised her head. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled mess, her expensive designer suit completely ruined. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a primal terror that stripped away every ounce of her pride. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking and devoid of its usual venomous authority. "What exactly are you?" I stepped over the shattered threshold, the emerald silk of my dress catching the cool night breeze. I stood on the grand front porch, looking down at the broken matriarch strapped to the gurney. The heavily armed federal agents and paramedics paused, sensing the profound weight of the moment. I crossed my arms and looked directly into Vivian's terrified eyes. "You always mocked me for growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of South Atlanta," I said, my voice projecting a calm, lethal certainty. "You constantly used my zip code as a punchline at your wealthy dinner parties. You told your friends that I crawled out of a dirty slum and should be on my knees thanking your son for elevating me. You called me a street rat just moments ago. But you conveniently forgot the actual history of this city, Vivian. You deliberately erased the violent truth of how those neighborhoods became impoverished in the first place." Vivian blinked rapidly, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She tried to look away, but my gaze pinned her to the stretcher. 60 years ago, South Atlanta was not a slum. I continued, slicing through her ignorance with cold, hard facts. It was a thriving, affluent Black community. It was a brilliant beacon of generational wealth and Black excellence. But your father was a greedy real estate developer with corrupt connections in the city council. He desperately wanted that prime real estate to build his commercial empire. So your father engineered a massive illegal redlining campaign. He bribed city officials to forge tax liens, rezone residential districts, and force brutal foreclosure on hundreds of acres of prime land owned by a prominent Black family. He stole their entire legacy, Vivian. He stole their generational wealth and used it to build the very foundation of this massive estate. He built your perfect aristocratic bloodline on top of stolen property. That prominent black family was my family. The color drained from Vivian's face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. DeAndre, who was still handcuffed on the floor behind me, let out a choked gasp. I did not even turn around to acknowledge him. My focus remained entirely on the broken woman on the stretcher. Did you really think a federal forensic accountant just accidentally bumped into your sloppy, arrogant son at a charity gala? I asked, letting a ruthless smile cross my face. Did you honestly believe I was blinded by his cheap tailored suits and leased sports cars? I did not marry your son for love, Vivian. I married into this corrupt, toxic family for access. I needed to get close enough to bypass the heavy security systems of this Buckhead mansion. I needed unlimited, unfettered access to the hidden physical archives your father left behind. Vivian shook her head in slow, horrified denial, but she could not formulate a single word. The crushing weight of my masterstroke was suffocating her. When DeAndre would go out drinking and spending his stolen Ponzi scheme money on Chelsea, I was not sitting at home crying. I explained, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. I was mapping every single inch of this house. I found the hidden reinforced safe concealed behind the vintage wine cellar in the basement. I spent 3 months meticulously cracking the biometric locks while you all slept soundly upstairs. I found your father's original handwritten ledgers. I found the mapped blueprints of the stolen South Atlanta neighborhoods. I found the original bribery receipts from 1964, detailing exactly which city officials he paid off to steal my ancestors' land. I reached deep into my large leather tote bag one final time, deliberately taking my time. I bypassed the IRS binders, the forged postnuptial agreement, and the heavy evidence bags. I carefully pulled out a large, fragile, century-old document, encased in a rigid protective archival sleeve. The aged yellowed parchment caught the flashing police lights. I held it up right in front of Vivian's trembling face. This is the original, authentic land grant deed to those hundreds of acres, I stated, my voice ringing with the undeniable power of ultimate justice. I have successfully recovered all the original documents, proving that your family's precious generational wealth is nothing but a cheap mirage built on stolen property. I quietly filed a massive restorative justice lawsuit in federal court last year. The judges have already reviewed the undeniable historical evidence. The federal government is officially seizing every single financial and physical asset your family ever purchased with that stolen money, including this mansion. Vivian let out a low, pathetic whimper, her eyes rolling back as the sheer magnitude of her utter and complete defeat crushed her very soul. You are not a matriarch, Vivian, I declared, stepping back and signaling the paramedics to take her away. You are simply a pathetic squatter who has been living on completely borrowed time. I am the true legal heir to absolutely everything you claim to own right now. The heavy wheels of the stretcher finally clattered away down the sweeping driveway, carrying the broken matriarch into the flashing red and blue lights of the dark Atlanta night. Vivian did not utter another sound. Her complete psychological and financial destruction was absolute and undeniable. I stood on the grand marble steps of the mansion, breathing in the cool night air and enjoying the undeniable taste of a century of delayed justice. But the chaotic spectacle on my driveway was not quite finished. Down by the line of armored federal vehicles, a shrill, high-pitched screaming shattered the temporary quiet. Chelsea was putting up the absolute fight of her life. 2 federal agents were attempting to guide her into the back of a reinforced cruiser. But she planted her expensive designer heels firmly onto the asphalt, refusing to budge an inch. Her blonde hair whipped wildly around her face as she thrashed against their tight grip. Her white fragility was fully activated, shifting from terrified victim to desperate negotiator in the blink of an eye. I want to speak to the person in charge, Chelsea shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. You cannot put me in there. I am a cooperating witness. I have vital information. I demand a plea deal right now. I walked slowly down the front steps, the emerald silk of my dress brushing against the pristine stone. I wanted to hear every single word of her pathetic, miserable betrayal. Chelsea spotted a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepping out of an unmarked black sedan. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and possessed the distinct tired authority of a federal prosecutor who had spent his entire career taking down organized crime rings. Chelsea immediately zeroed in on him, reading his status instantly. "Sir," she cried out, fresh tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Sir, please, you have to listen to me. I will give you absolutely everything. I will give you the offshore account numbers. I will give you the routing codes to the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I know exactly how Vivian laundered the stolen money. I know exactly how DeAndre faked the commercial real estate appraisals. I can give you decades of their massive financial crimes. Just give me full federal immunity, and I will testify against all of them in court tomorrow morning." The federal prosecutor closed the door of his sedan and walked slowly over to the struggling woman. He crossed his arms and looked at her with an expression of mild clinical curiosity. Chelsea took his silence as active encouragement. She doubled down, leaning heavily into the most toxic, racist tropes she had harbored since the day she married into this prominent black family. She threw the very people who had welcomed her and funded her luxury lifestyle directly under the bus without a single ounce of hesitation. "You have to understand my terrifying situation," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fake, helpless terror. "I was completely trapped. I was a captive in this horrible house. These people are violent, unpredictable criminals. They are vicious thugs wearing expensive suits. DeAndre and Jamal threatened my life constantly. They manipulated my fragile mental state. I was terrified of what they would do to me if I did not play along with their illegal schemes. I am just a frightened housewife who got caught up in their ghetto mafia tactics. You cannot send me to a federal prison. I will not survive a single week in there. I am a victim of their toxic culture. I will give you every single piece of evidence you need to lock them up for the rest of their natural lives. Just let me walk away clean." Jamal, who was currently being patted down against the hood of an adjacent police cruiser, turned his head sharply. He heard every single hateful, racist word his beautiful, delicate wife just spat at the federal authorities. He heard her casually offer him up to the brutal prison system just to save her own skin. Fresh, hot tears welled in his eyes as the absolute reality of her complete betrayal finally sank in. She had never loved him for a single second. She had only loved his bank account and his pathetic willingness to look the other way while she destroyed me. The federal prosecutor listened to Chelsea deliver her desperate racist monologue without interrupting once. He let her lay all her cards out on the table. When she finally ran out of breath, he simply turned his head and looked directly at me, standing a few feet away on the driveway. I offered the prosecutor a slight knowing nod. He nodded back, confirming that the trap was perfectly set. He turned his attention back to the crying, shaking woman in tight handcuffs. "Ma'am," the prosecutor said, his voice remarkably calm and entirely devoid of pity. "I appreciate your willingness to cooperate with the federal government. However, we already have all the financial routing numbers. We already have the offshore account details. Agent Iman delivered a comprehensive digital dossier containing every single ledger this family ever touched. Your financial testimony is completely useless to us today." Chelsea blinked, her fake tears drying up instantly. Her jaw dropped as the terrifying realization set in. "But I can testify about the attempted murder," she stammered desperately, trying to find a new viable angle. "I can testify that DeAndre planned to kill her. I can prove he bought the heavy metal poison." The prosecutor let out a short, dry laugh. He unclasped his leather briefcase right on the hood of the cruiser and pulled out a single transcribed document. "We do not need your testimony for that either," he stated flatly, "because Agent Iman also provided us with a highly encrypted audio recording extracted directly from your hidden burner phone. A recording dated exactly 3 days before your romantic trip to Paris. Do you remember making a phone call to a very specific individual operating out of a salvage yard in South Atlanta?" Chelsea went completely rigid. All the blood rushed out of her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her mouth opened, but she could not draw a single breath. The prosecutor read directly from the transcript, holding the paper up to the flashing red and blue lights. "I need a clean professional job," the transcript read. "The target is my husband Jamal. He is a weak, pathetic liability. Once he signs the family trust shares over to me, I need his brakes cut on the highway. I need him eliminated before the federal authorities start asking questions about the missing funds." And if his mother Vivian starts asking questions, I will pay you an extra $50,000 to stage a violent home invasion and take her out too. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail from across the driveway, collapsing against the hood of the police cruiser. His own wife had not just planned to steal his money. She had actively contracted a hitman to butcher him and his mother to cover her tracks. The deep, horrifying reality of his entire marriage being a calculated long con finally broke his mind. He sobbed into the metal hood of the car, a completely shattered and ruined man. The prosecutor folded the paper and slipped it back into his briefcase. He looked at Chelsea with absolute disgust. "You were not a terrified captive manipulated by this family," the prosecutor stated, slamming his briefcase shut. "You orchestrated the entire exit strategy. You planned to wipe out the remaining heirs and run away with the entire fraudulent estate. The federal government does not offer plea deals to the violent mastermind of a murder-for-hire conspiracy. You are not a cooperating witness, Chelsea. You are the primary target of our racketeering investigation." Chelsea let out a raw, guttural shriek that tore through the night air. It was the sound of a woman realizing she was going to die inside a concrete cell. She thrashed violently, kicking her expensive heels at the agent, screaming that it was all a lie, that she had been completely framed. She demanded her lawyer, she demanded her civil rights, she demanded special treatment, but her entitled words meant absolutely nothing here on the pavement. The federal agents lost whatever remaining patience they had left for her theatrics. Two heavily armored officers grabbed her roughly by the shoulders and violently shoved her downward. She hit the plastic back seat of the federal cruiser with a hard, unforgiving thud. Her legs were shoved inside without a single ounce of gentleness, and the heavy reinforced door was slammed shut right in her face. The automatic locks engaged with a loud, definitive click, sealing her fate forever. I watched her press her tear-streaked face against the thick security glass, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her dark, miserable future swallowed her whole. She had tried to destroy an entire black family for profit, and instead she had built her own personal permanent prison. The heavy steel door of Chelsea's cruiser slammed shut, locking her inside her own personal nightmare. But the spectacle spilling out onto the pristine streets of Buckhead was far from over. The chaotic symphony of shouting federal agents, wailing sirens, and heavy tactical boots had completely shattered the quiet, exclusive peace of the neighborhood. This was not a community used to late-night disturbances. This was an enclave of old money tech billionaires and generational wealth, where the only sounds usually heard after midnight were the gentle hum of luxury pool filters and private security patrols. Now the entire street was wide awake. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal task force vehicles bounced wildly off the towering white pillars and manicured hedges of the surrounding multi-million-dollar estates. One by one, heavy mahogany front doors swung open across the neighborhood. Wealthy neighbors stepped out onto their sprawling, perfectly landscaped lawns. They wore silk sleeping robes and cashmere wraps, holding their glowing smartphones up in the dark to record every single second of the incredible downfall happening on my driveway. I stood at the top of my grand marble steps, the cool night breeze catching the emerald silk of my dress. I watched the absolute social execution of the family that had tried to bury me. The paramedics rolled Vivian down the long, sweeping driveway first. The aristocratic matriarch was still strapped tightly to the squeaking public hospital stretcher. She had spent decades hosting charity galas, sipping champagne with the very neighbors who were now live-streaming her arrest. She turned her head weakly, trying to hide her tear-streaked face from the flashing cameras. A woman named Patricia, who Vivian had relentlessly competed with for the presidency of the local country club, stood at the edge of her driveway recording the entire scene with a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Vivian closed her eyes tightly, unable to bear the sheer crushing weight of her public humiliation. Her fake legacy was dead, and she was being wheeled away like common garbage. Next came Jamal. The cowardly brother-in-law was practically dragged down the front steps by two massive FBI agents. His expensive tailored trousers were torn at the knees from crawling on the glass-covered floor. He was sobbing loudly, his chest heaving with heavy, pathetic gasps. He looked around wildly, searching the faces of the neighbors for a single ounce of sympathy. He found absolutely none. The community simply watched him weep their phones. capturing the exact moment he realized his complicity had cost him his entire life. He stumbled toward a waiting federal transport van, a broken, shattered man who had enabled a monster and lost everything in the process. Finally, DeAndre was marched out of the front doors. The federal agents gripped his arms firmly, pushing him forward into the harsh, unforgiving glare of the police spotlights. His custom Italian suit was ripped at the shoulder and stained with his own blood from the brutal brawl with his brother. His face was heavily bruised, his lips split and swollen. The arrogant, confident strut he had spent years perfecting was entirely gone, replaced by a heavy, dragging shuffle. As the agents led him down the sweeping driveway, DeAndre stopped dead in his tracks. He planted his expensive shoes onto the asphalt, refusing to move forward. His dark eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as he looked toward the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. 3 heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were backing slowly onto the property. The Federal Asset Forfeiture Division was not wasting a single second. The agents were already hooking heavy steel chains to the axles of DeAndre's prized luxury fleet. His matte black G-Wagon, the vehicle he drove to his country club meetings, was hoisted into the air. The pristine white Bentley he had bought using the stolen mortgage funds was dragged unceremoniously onto a flatbed. DeAndre watched his empire evaporate into thin air right in front of his eyes. The cars, the house, the money, the status. It was all being dismantled and seized under the blinding lights of a federal raid. The wealthy neighbors he had tried so desperately to impress were whispering among themselves, pointing at the repo trucks and shaking their heads in disgust. He was not a tech visionary. He was not a real estate titan. He was just a cheap fraud who had finally been caught. "Move it," an FBI agent barked, shoving DeAndre hard in the back. DeAndre stumbled forward, but he dug his heels in again, turning his battered face back toward the mansion. He looked past the flashing lights, past the federal agents, and locked his eyes directly onto me. I stood at the top of the marble stairs, looking down at him with absolute total supremacy. "Iman," he shouted, his voice cracking, breaking through the noise of the idling engines and the radio chatter. He pulled against the cuffs, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate, pleading energy. "Iman, wait, please, just give me 1 second." I did not step back. I did not fold my arms. I walked slowly down the first 3 marble steps, closing the distance just enough so I could hear whatever pathetic final lie he had formulated in his ruined mind. "What do you want, DeAndre?" I asked, my voice projecting a cold, lethal calm that silenced the murmuring neighbors. He stared up at me, tears mixing with the blood on his cheek. He was completely stripped of his arrogance, leaving only a desperate, manipulating narcissist, trying to play his very last card. "I know I ruined everything," he choked out, his voice shaking with manufactured emotion. "I know I am a monster for what I did to you. But before the money, before the greed and the cheating, I really loved you, Iman. I swear to God I loved you when we first met. Please, I have absolutely nothing left. Just take one photograph of us together. Just give me one picture so I can remember what I lost, so I can remember the only good thing I ever had." It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Even in federal handcuffs, facing decades in prison, he was trying to hook me. He wanted to see a flicker of pity in my eyes. He wanted to know that he still held some tiny fragmented piece of my heart. He wanted to feel like he still had power over my emotions. I looked down at his crying, bleeding face, and I felt absolutely nothing but clinical disgust. I did not soften my gaze. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I smoothly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen, opening the high-definition camera application. I walked down 2 more steps, holding the phone up perfectly, leveling the lens directly at his pathetic, sobbing face. DeAndre looked up at the camera, forcing a tragic, broken expression, hoping to capture a moment of shared grief. I tapped the screen. The bright white flash illuminated the dark driveway, capturing every single detail of his split lip, his ruined designer suit, the heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists, and the flashing red and blue police lights reflecting in his terrified eyes. I lowered the phone and looked him dead in the eyes, a ruthless, victorious smile spreading across my face. "I will make sure to send this to the prison commissary," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. DeAndre's face crumbled completely. The final desperate hope he had clung to vanished entirely. He let out a loud, wretched sob, dropping his head toward his chest. The federal agents did not give him another second to mourn his shattered ego. They grabbed him by the shoulders, shoving him violently forward and forcing him into the back of the armored transport vehicle. The heavy metal door of the armored transport vehicle slammed shut with a loud, definitive crash, sealing DeAndre inside his new permanent reality. The convoy of federal cruisers and tactical vans began their slow, methodical procession down the long, sweeping driveway. The harsh, flashing red and blue lights painted the manicured lawns and towering oak trees in alternating shades of stark justice. I stood perfectly still on the top step of the grand marble entrance, watching the vehicles roll away one by one. The wealthy neighbors who had gathered in their silk robes and cashmere wraps remained completely frozen on their perfectly trimmed grass. They watched the spectacular downfall of the neighborhood's loudest family in absolute stunned silence. Not a single person whispered. Not a single person moved to intervene. They simply recorded the final moments of a fraudulent dynasty evaporating into the dark Atlanta night. I raised my hand, giving a sharp single nod to the captain of my private security detail. He immediately keyed his radio, and the massive wrought iron gates of the estate began to swing shut. The heavy iron groaned slightly as it moved, sliding seamlessly along the reinforced tracks until the two halves met in the center with a loud, resonating clang. The automatic locking mechanism engaged, instantly shutting out the prying eyes of the neighbors and sealing my absolute victory. The flashing police lights faded into the distance, disappearing around the wealthy suburban corner, leaving my street in total peaceful darkness. I turned around and walked slowly back through the ruined threshold of the mansion. My emerald silk dress brushed softly against the cool stone steps. I stepped over the jagged splinters of the shattered oak doors and entered the grand foyer. The air inside the house felt remarkably different. It was incredibly light and entirely breathable. The heavy, suffocating presence of arrogance and racial contempt was completely gone. There was no more arrogant mother-in-law, demanding premium service and insulting my working-class background. There was no more racist sister-in-law, weaponizing her white tears to manipulate the men in the room. There was no more cowardly brother-in-law, enabling a culture of toxic abuse. And most importantly, there was no more treacherous husband pretending to be a brilliant tech visionary while actively poisoning the woman who shared his bed. The sprawling Buckhead estate, which had been built on land stolen from my very own ancestors, was finally returned to its rightful bloodline. Every square inch of the imported marble, every soaring archway, and every perfectly manicured blade of grass outside now belonged entirely to me. The house was completely and utterly silent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the central air conditioning and the soft crunch of my heels stepping over the tiny sparkling shards of the shattered glass coffee table. The destruction in the room was a beautiful, chaotic testament to the war I had just decisively won. I walked gracefully past the blood-stained marble floor, refusing to let a single drop touch the hem of my immaculate dress. I reached the ornate wet bar tucked beneath the sweeping grand staircase. The crystal ice bucket still held the chilled vintage Dom Perignon. I picked up the heavy green bottle and poured myself a fresh glass, listening to the crisp, satisfying fizz of the expensive champagne. I walked across the massive living room, bypassing the empty spaces on the walls where the fake art had hung just hours ago. I stepped right up to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling backyard and the distant glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cool, clean air deep into my lungs. For the first time in 6 months, my chest did not ache. My joints did not burn with the agonizing fire of heavy metal toxins. I ran my free hand through my thick, healthy hair, feeling the strong roots firmly anchored to my scalp. The lethargy was entirely gone. The brutal nausea had completely vanished. The Swiss detox clinic had done its job perfectly. My body was operating at peak optimal performance. I was a brilliant, wealthy black woman standing at the absolute pinnacle of my power, holding the deed to a massive estate I had secured with my own unmatched intellect. The sudden sharp ringing of my secure federal smartphone broke the pristine silence of the mansion. I pulled the device from my leather tote bag and checked the encrypted caller identification. It was my managing director at the federal agency in Washington. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I expected a standard debriefing on the arrests, but instead I heard the loud celebratory cheering of dozens of hard-working federal agents in the bustling background. My director chuckled, a sound of pure, unadulterated professional pride. Iman, he said, his voice booming with absolute respect. The intake processing is complete. We just secured every single offshore routing number and locked down the remaining shell companies. You did it. You just single-handedly executed the largest domestic fraud and embezzlement takedown in the history of the state of Georgia. The entire Romero cartel cell operating out of Miami is currently being rounded up based on the wire fraud connections you exposed during the sting. The local police have taken Vivian into the cold, stark interrogation room, and she is already singing like a cornered bird, trying to throw her own dead husband under the bus for the brutal Lake murder. DeAndre and Chelsea are in separate federal holding cells, blaming each other for the missing millions. Your forensic mapping was absolutely flawless. I took another sip of champagne, staring out at the beautiful city lights reflecting off my private pool. It was just basic accounting. I replied, my voice completely smooth and level. You just have to know exactly where the rats like to hide their cheese. My director laughed again, a rich, booming sound that filled the quiet room. The director of the entire agency wants to present you with a commendation medal next month, he announced. But until then, you are officially off the clock. You have a mountain of unused paid leave and a massive bonus hitting your account by Friday. Take a vacation, Iman. You have more than earned it. Where do you want to go? Paris, I replied, my voice steady and resolute as I looked at the reflection of the city lights shimmering across the surface of my private pool. I hear it is absolutely beautiful this time of year. 6 months passed since that chaotic night on my driveway. The justice system moves slowly for most, but when you hand federal prosecutors a perfectly wrapped bow of forensic evidence, wire fraud, timestamps, and recorded murder conspiracies, the wheels of justice spin with terrifying speed. The sweeping indictments hit the local and national news like a massive tidal wave. The highly publicized trial was swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of mercy. DeAndre, Jamal, and Vivian were all handed consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. They were permanently locked away inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, forced to trade their tailored suits and exclusive country club memberships for scratchy uniforms and cold concrete walls. Chelsea did not fare any better. Despite her desperate racist attempts to secure a plea deal, the audio recording of her trying to hire a hitman cemented her absolute downfall. She was thrown into a harsh state women's prison. Stripped of her wealthy enablers and her fragile Southern belle persona, she was completely isolated and universally despised by the general population. The woman who once complained about the smell of my cooking and plotted to steal an entire estate was now forced to scrub cafeteria trays just to afford basic commissary items. Her white tears held absolutely no currency behind steel bars. I stepped out of the back of a sleek black town car, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The harsh, unforgiving architecture of the federal penitentiary loomed over the gravel parking lot, a sprawling fortress of razor wire and gray concrete. I adjusted the lapels of my crisp white designer suit. I was the absolute picture of radiant health and immense wealth. My autoimmune disease remained completely in remission, the heavy metal toxins long purged from my bloodstream. My skin glowed, my hair was thick and styled perfectly, and my bank accounts held the recovered generational wealth of my ancestors, safely secured in ironclad trusts. I walked toward the heavily guarded visitor entrance, my designer heels crunching softly against the gravel. The prison guards processed my identification with respectful efficiency, recognizing my name from the highly publicized trial that had captivated the city. I was escorted through a maze of sterile white hallways and heavy steel doors that slammed shut with echoing finality. I entered the bleak visitor center and took a seat on a hard metal stool positioned right in front of a thick reinforced glass partition. I placed a single crisp white envelope on the narrow metal ledge in front of me and waited patiently in the sterile silence. 10 minutes later, a heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly. A prison guard escorted an inmate into the small visiting booth. It was DeAndre. The sight of my former husband sent a brief momentary shock through my system. The man sitting down on the opposite side of the reinforced glass was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, charming real estate developer who used to spend hours perfecting his hair and admiring his expensive watches was entirely gone. 6 months in a maximum security federal lockup had aged him a decade. His shoulders were slumped, his frame was gaunt and hollow, and his bright orange jumpsuit hung off his body like a cheap, oversized sack. Deep dark circles bruised the skin under his sunken eyes, and his hands trembled violently as he reached for the black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the wall. I picked up the receiver on my side of the glass, holding it loosely against my ear. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him. DeAndre stared at me through the smudged plexiglass, his eyes watering. He looked at my pristine white suit, my glowing, healthy skin, and the quiet, absolute power radiating from my posture. Hot, miserable tears spilled over his eyelashes and tracked slowly down his hollow cheeks. He gripped the phone receiver tightly, preparing himself for the inevitable onslaught. He expected me to scream. He expected me to gloat. I expected a long, triumphant monologue, detailing exactly how much I was enjoying the millions of dollars and the massive estate I had legally stripped from his deceitful hands. He desperately wanted me to engage with him, to show any sign of lingering emotion, even if it was pure, unadulterated hatred. I did not gloat. I did not offer him the satisfaction of my anger or the comfort of my pity. I simply reached forward and slid the crisp white envelope through the narrow metal transaction slot at the bottom of the glass partition. DeAndre looked down at the envelope resting on his side of the ledge. He set the phone receiver down on his lap and picked up the paper with violently shaking fingers. He tore open the seal and pulled out the thick folded documents inside. The first document was a finalized court-ordered divorce decree. It detailed the complete dissolution of our marriage, but it also contained a very specific legal clause. I had successfully petitioned the court to entirely strip him of the marital name we had shared. I reclaimed my maiden name and legally erased his surname from every single one of my personal and corporate assets. He was officially a forgotten footnote in my life. DeAndre stared at the decree, a fresh wave of tears hitting his eyes as he moved it aside to look at the second item in the envelope. It was a single piece of glossy cardstock, a premium first-class boarding pass. The departure city was Atlanta. The destination was Paris, France. The departure time was scheduled for later that exact evening. He picked the phone receiver back up, pressing it hard against his ear. His breathing was ragged and shallow, his eyes darting frantically from the boarding pass to my calm, composed face. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice completely smooth and dangerously level. "I am taking that vacation you tried to kill me for," I said, the words slicing through the static of the prison phone line with lethal precision. DeAndre opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to apologize, to offer some pathetic final excuse, but I did not give him the chance. "Enjoy the cafeteria food, DeAndre." I hung up the phone, placing the black plastic receiver firmly back onto the metal cradle. The sharp click echoed with absolute finality. DeAndre slammed his hand against the reinforced glass, sobbing openly now, calling my name through the thick, soundproof barrier, but his voice was completely muted. He was trapped in a silent concrete box, a ghost haunting his own miserable existence. I did not look back. I turned my back on the glass partition, on my former husband, and on the entire toxic chapter of my life. I walked confidently down the sterile prison hallway, the sound of my designer heels tapping a steady, victorious rhythm against the linoleum floor. I pushed through the final set of heavy steel doors and stepped out into the prison courtyard. The bright, blinding sunlight hit my face, instantly warming my skin. I took a deep, clean breath of fresh air. My car was waiting, the engine purring softly, ready to take me to the airport. I walked toward it, fully reclaiming my life, my health, and my empire. The greatest lesson I learned is that your worth is never defined by people who try to destroy you. When the family you trusted leaves you in the dark, you must become your own light. True power does not come from screaming or seeking validation. It comes from staying perfectly calm, trusting your intellect, and moving in absolute silence until you are ready to reclaim your life. Toxic loyalty is a trap, and you are entirely capable of building your own empire from the ashes. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys of ultimate justice.